I took a seasonal position in Northern California back in 2013, right at the tail end of summer. It was my second year with the Forest Service, and I just wrapped up a stint in Arizona. When I got the offer to work in the Shasta Trinity National Forest, I jumped on it. I'd always heard stories about the region: thick woods, strange tales, and of course, the ever-present hush-hush chatter about Shasta itself. But I wasn't much for stories. I was there to work, log my hours, and hopefully get considered for a permanent ranger slot down the line. My base was a small outpost cabin a few miles off Highway 89 in a patch of forest between McLeod and the southern foot of Mount Shasta. The place was remote. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no neighbors in sight unless you counted bears or mule deer. The closest town was maybe a 40-minute drive down switchbacks and Forest Service roads that were mostly gravel. My assignment was simple: monitor foot traffic, patrol a few trails, make sure no one was illegally growing weed, which still happen now and then despite legalization shifts, and keep an eye out for any wildfire risks. The first few weeks were peaceful, almost too quiet. I'd hike in the early mornings, make rounds in the afternoon, and spend evenings drinking cheap coffee on the porch of the cabin, listening to the woods settle in for the night. If you spent any real time in the forest, you know what I mean by settle in. Birds quiet down, the wind dies, and there's this stillness that creeps in like the trees are holding their breath. That stillness always put me a little on edge. I'd seen a few bears, but they were smaller black bears, usually more interested in turning over rocks for bugs than messing with me. Once in a while, I'd hear something big moving through the trees while on patrol, branches cracking, brush being pushed aside, but it always passed quickly. The rule out there was simple: if it doesn't mess with you, don't mess with it. Let the forest be. One Thursday in late September, things started to feel off. I was doing my rounds near a trail known as Ridge Loop. It wasn't one of the popular ones, more of a forgotten connector path that had overgrown with time and didn't get much foot traffic. My map still marked it as active, but it clearly hadn't seen maintenance in a while. I decided I'd check it out anyway. The hike started normal. Light wind, sun coming through the trees, ground dry from weeks without rain. I noticed scat along the edge of the trail, bear likely, and a few claw marks on a dead fir tree. Again, nothing unusual. Around midday, I stopped by a small creek to refill my water and eat. I sat on a down log, just soaking it in. That's when I noticed it. The silence. No wind. No birds. No insects. Nothing. I know how cliché that sounds. But when you live out in the woods for long enough, you learn to pay attention to the patterns. A quiet patch of forest isn't abnormal. But total silence, no chirps, no buzzing, no rustle, is unnatural. It's the forest holding its breath. That's the only way I can describe it. I stood up, slowly scanned the tree line. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I hadn't seen another person on that trail since I got there, but I checked my sidearm anyway. We carried issued Glock 22s at the time. Not because we expected trouble, but because out here, backup was hours away and you couldn't take chances. I kept moving, a little more alert than usual. The trail narrowed ahead and bent around a rock outcrop. As I rounded the bend, I saw something strange, a partial footprint in the dirt. Human, barefoot, large. Not boot tread, no sock print, just a single step like someone had been walking barefoot through the woods and turned off the trail. The heel was deep, toes light, and the stride was long, like they were moving fast. I crouched down to take a closer look. The print was fresh, maybe a few hours old at most. That put me on edge. I was 10 miles out from any trailhead, deep in overgrown forest, and now I had signs of someone barefoot, no gear, no visible supplies, moving through my patrol zone. That's not normal. Not out here. I decided to follow it. Not far, just enough to get an idea of who or what was moving through. About 50 feet off the trail, I found more signs. Another footprint, broken twigs, bent fringe. Then, silence again. Not even my footsteps seemed to make sound. I was deep enough now that my radio was garbage. Just static. I decided to mark the location with flagging tape and head back to the trail to log it later. That night, back at the cabin, I logged the prints and unusual activity in my report. I kept it dry. No speculation, just facts. but stayed in my head. Who the hell hikes barefoot that deep into the woods? And why was it just a single line of tracks, like they'd come out of nowhere and vanished again? A few days passed. I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was off. Even back at the cabin, I started noticing small things. A couple tools were moved in the shed. My firewood pile, which I'd stacked tightly, had a few logs pulled out and left in the dirt. One morning, my porch chair was tipped over, and a muddy smear ran across the railing like someone, or something, had braced themselves against it with a dirty hand. It didn't feel like a bear. Bears rip, tear, and break things. This felt calculated. On Monday, I went back to the Ridge Loop area. I brought my pack, sidearm, a few flag markers, and extra batteries. My plan was to backtrack those prints and set up a small motion trigger trail Kim I had in my gear. Nothing fancy, just enough to maybe get a glimpse if someone was out there. I got to the site around noon and started following the marks again, this time farther than before. The terrain got rough, rocky, uneven, and brushy. After about 30 minutes of slow walking and scanning, I found something that made my stomach turn, a rough structure, maybe 5 feet tall, made of snapped branches, bark, and moss. It wasn't a hunting blind. It wasn't natural. It looked like someone had built a crude shelter. No tools used, just brute force. The limbs used were twisted and shoved into the ground, not cut. Inside the little lean-to, I found a few small animal bones. Looked like squirrel or rabbit, cleaned completely of meat and fur. Nothing around it looked scavenged, just bones in a neat pile. I stepped back, set the trail cam up nearby, and marked the spot on GPS. I didn't feel comfortable lingering. Something about that spot was wrong. Not scary in a ghost story way, just off, like I wasn't supposed to be there. That night, back at the cabin, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I drove back to the camera spot early to check if anything had triggered it. When I got there, the camera was gone. Completely gone. Not broken. Not on the ground. Just gone. The tree I'd mounted it to had deep scratches on the bark, like something strong had dug into it. Whatever took the camera, it did it without leaving much of a trace. I took a few steps back and scanned the woods, and that's when I saw it. Way off in the distance, between 2 trees, something moved. Too far to make out details. Tall, upright, grayish-brown. One step, then still. I froze. I watched for maybe 10 seconds. Then it turned, slowly, and moved back into the forest. Not fast, not like it was running, like it didn't care that I was watching. I stayed in place for a long time after that. I don't know how long. Then I turned and hiked straight back to the truck. I didn't run, just moved steadily and quietly. That evening, I made the call to my supervisor. I didn't say what I'd seen, just told them the area around Ridge Loop had signs of illegal activity and that I'd recommend closing off the trail until further notice. 2 days later, they put up a temporary closure sign. No questions asked. I didn't argue. I wrapped up the rest of the season without going back to that ridge. In the last week before I left, I talked to an old-timer who'd been working out of McLeod for years. I didn't tell him what I'd seen, just asked if the Ridge Loop area ever had anything strange. He paused for a moment, looked off into the trees, then said, "Stay on the main trails." That's all I'll say. I nodded. We didn't talk about it again. That was over 10 years ago now. I don't work for the Forest Service anymore. Life moved on, but I still think about that spot, that shelter, those prints. I still get goosebumps remembering how the woods went silent and how something watched me without hiding. It wasn't a bear. I've seen dozens of bears. It wasn't a person either, not like any person I've ever seen. But it was real, and it was out there. Still is probably. Whatever it is that lives in those woods around Mount Shasta, it doesn't want to be found. And if you're smart, you won't try. Just be respectful and stay on the trail. I've worn the uniform for going on 9 years now, hopping around from one park to the next, working mostly seasonal gigs, scraping by with part-time benefits, living in dusty cabins or tents more months than I'd like to count. And despite the years, despite the thousands of miles walked, the hundreds of visitors helped, despite the training and education I've gathered, people still look at me like I'm some kind of forest wizard. "Oh wow, are you a real park ranger?" they ask, eyes wide like they just saw a unicorn. "Yes, Karen, I'm real. And no, I can't grant your wish to move the bison closer to the boardwalk for your photo op. I've smiled through endless photo requests. I've been asked where the bathrooms are more times than I can count, even while I'm shoulder deep in trail maintenance or halfway through bandaging a kid's scraped knee. Most people mean well, sure, but most don't really get what it's like out here, where our jobs actually are, what we carry behind the smiles and public-facing patience. This story, this thing that happened, it's one of those times that peeled all the smiles off. One of those times that reminded me, no one's coming to save you, not out here. You either handle it or you don't. I was assigned to a large national park in the Southwest. Won't name which one, but you'd recognize it from the postcards. Think Red Rock, deep canyons, heat that boils your brain by noon. I was working on a backcountry team that season, mostly focused on trail maintenance and environmental monitoring. People think rangers are either giving tours or arresting poachers. They never think of the work in between, the sweaty, bureaucratic, thankless middle where we spend most of our hours. It was late May. The weather was just shifting from tolerable to dangerous. We were getting a higher number of visitors every day. Hikers, families, influencers with drones they weren't supposed to have. Everyone coming for their slice of nature. But only the clean slice, not the hard one. That week, we had a report come in from a maintenance crew. A remote footbridge had been damaged in a flash flood earlier in the year. Nobody had gotten around to checking it yet. Too far off the usual loops, too deep into the backcountry. The bridge connected two legs of a backcountry loop trail, only used by the more experienced backpackers. Folks who could handle themselves. In theory. So I was sent out. Just me. My pack, my GPS unit, my radio, and a clipboard with a printed checklist of what I was supposed to inspect. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't optional. You can't have people crossing unstable infrastructure, not unless you want a lawsuit or worse. The hike out was long. It took me the better part of a day. I camped overnight near a small creek bed, dry this time of year, and set out before sunrise the next morning to finish the loop toward the bridge site. This area had some elevation gain, and the terrain was rough. Loose rock, tight switchbacks, thick brush at certain turns. You had to pay attention, and I did. Around midday, I reached the bridge, or what was left of it. Only one of the wooden footings was still attached. The rest of the structure had been swept down into the narrow canyon below. All I could see were shattered boards caught between boulders 20 feet below. The river had carved a steep channel through that part of the canyon, and without the bridge, the trail just stopped. Anyone trying to cross here would have to climb down one side for the river and climb back up. Risky in ideal conditions. Deadly if the water rose again. I took photos, marked my GPS coordinates, and filled out my notes. I need to flag this trail segment for temporary closure and request a reconstruction team. That was going to take at least a year, maybe more. Not that visitors would understand. They'd ask me next week why the bridge wasn't fixed yet, as if we had wands instead of paperwork. As I turned to start my hike back, I noticed something odd. A small pile of gear, weathered, sun-faded. Looked like someone had left a backpack tucked beneath a scrub oak not 20 feet off the trail. I walked over. The pack was half buried under leaves and dust. Judging by the sun bleaching and wear, it had been there for a while. Maybe since the flood. I called it into dispatch, gave them the GPS tag, and told them I'd bring it back if I had space. Inside I found a water bottle, empty, some wrappers, a torn rain jacket, and a spiral notebook sealed in a Ziploc bag. That last part caught my attention. People don't usually go through the effort unless what's inside matters to them. I stuffed the notebook in my side pocket and carried the rest of the bag. It added weight to the hike, but I was used to that. You get good at carrying things that don't belong to you in this line of work. That night, I camped again, closer to the halfway mark this time. I pitched near a rock formation that blocked the worst of the wind. The heat didn't fully let up, even after dark. I ate a protein bar, drank filtered creek water, and finally opened the notebook. The handwriting was jagged, tight. Some of the entries were just dates and meals. But toward the middle, things changed. The tone darkened. Still no cell signal. Trail should have looped back by now. I think I took the wrong split. Water running low. I tried to backtrack, but ended up at the same place again. It doesn't make sense. I marked the tree, but it was gone when I came back around. There's something off about this place. No birds. No wind. Even the trees feel dead. I felt my jaw tighten. I'd read journals like this before. Notes from people who got lost, turned around, and slowly slipped from calm into panic. You could hear it in the way their writing changed. The missing punctuation, the incomplete thoughts, the way they started talking to themselves through the page. I heard something last night. I thought it was footsteps, but maybe it was just the wind. I keep thinking I see someone behind the rocks, but no one ever steps out. If anyone finds this, tell my sister I'm sorry. I thought I could handle it. That was the last entry. I stared at the pages for a long time, just sitting there in the dark with my headlamp cutting a cone through the dust. I knew what had happened. The bridge had washed out. Hiker gets turned around trying to find a way around. Maybe slips. Maybe gets heat stroke. Maybe just gives up. Nobody finds them until someone like me stumbles across their gear months later. It wasn't a ghost story. It was worse. It was real. Next morning, I got up at first light. I was tired, dehydrated, and sore. But I wanted to get out of there. Fast. On the way back, I noticed something strange. Not supernatural. Not magical. Just wrong. I passed a cairn, stacked rocks marking the trail. Well, I didn't remember building. We weren't supposed to add new ones without official review. That was policy. I walked closer. The rocks were wrong. The shape. The formation. Almost like a small person had built it, or someone in a hurry. It didn't look like the other trail markers we used. I crouched down and found something wedged beneath the top stone. Another page, torn from the notebook. Just 5 words, scrawled in the same tight handwriting. Don't follow the dry creek. I looked up, heart pounding. The cairn was pointing toward the dry creek bed, not the trail. Someone had tried to mislead whoever came next. Whether by accident or desperation, they'd marked a false path. If I hadn't known better, if I hadn't memorized this section of trail, I might have followed it. Might have ended up just like them. By the time I got back to the station, the sun was baking everything in sight. I turned to my notes, submitted the pack, and handed over the notebook. Our team opened a cold case investigation, but we all knew how it would go. Unless they found remains, it would stay open, unsolved. Just another backcountry disappearance. I stayed on for another 2 months that season. Every time I passed that trailhead, I thought about the notebook, about the false cairn, about the quiet desperation you feel when the land doesn't care if you live or die. Visitors kept coming. They kept asking the same questions, smiling for the same selfies, assuming I had answers I didn't. Some days it took everything I had not to snap, not to scream at the entitled ones demanding new trail access, complaining about closure signs, refusing to pay the park fee. One day, a man asked if I could just open the gate to a damaged trail section so his family could hike it for photos. I told him it wasn't safe. He said, "Aren't you a ranger? Can't you make it work?" I looked at him, eyes tired, heart heavy. "No," I said, "I'm not a magician." And I walked away. I was stationed as a park ranger for about 6 years in northern Ontario. The district I covered was massive, dense boreal forest stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. My assignment was one of the more remote ones, and the territory I was responsible for barely saw any human traffic outside of the occasional bush pilot, an off-grid hunter, or an old trapper who knew how to navigate the backwoods the way most folks know their hometown streets. Our base camp was a single-room ranger cabin near the edge of a wide river that fed into Lake Wabanash. The lake, and everything north of it, was an untouched sprawl of pines, bogs, glacial rock formations, and ancient hills too remote for hikers and too difficult to build anything on. I patrolled the area on a snowmobile in winter and a small aluminum boat in the summer, depending on the time of year. The rest of the time, I was alone, logging reports, checking wildlife cams, and maintaining trail markers for a few fly-in fishing lodges that were only active during June and July. It was mid-February the year this happened. Temperatures were down in the -20s, and I was doing a winter survey along a route that I only covered once a season. About 50 miles northwest of the ranger cabin was an old fire tower site near Tree Line Ridge, a jagged stretch of land that marked the edge of a sharp elevation drop into dense marshland. The trail up, there was barely even trail in winter. It hadn't been maintained in years because no one went that far anymore. Too risky, too wild, too isolated. But I had to check on a few old marker posts that we used as backups for aerial search crews. The satellite signal gets patchy that deep into the forest, so every 10 or 15 miles we kept tall aluminum poles with colored tags and reflective tape to help pilots get their bearings during flyovers. I loaded up my sled with fuel, rations, my .308 rifle, and survival gear. I knew I wouldn't make it back the same day, so I packed my bivy sack and a portable stove. The plan was to get to the old fire tower clearing, camp the night, and swing back around in the morning. Easy enough on paper. The snow was deep and dry, powdery in places, and crusted with ice in others. It took me most of the day just to reach the ridge. By then, the light was going fast. You don't get much of a sunset in those parts during the winter. Just a slow dimming of light until everything is blue and then black. I set up camp near the base of where the tower used to be. It was taken down in the early 90s, but the clearing was still visible from the way the trees refused to reclaim the flattened patch of land. Maybe it was the soil, maybe it was the old concrete foundation that was buried under the snow. I didn't care. It was flat ground, and that's all I needed. That night, the wind picked up. I couldn't sleep, not because of fear or anything like that, but because something was gnawing at me. A weird feeling like I had missed something. I kept thinking about the way the land looked as I rode in. Like I had seen something that didn't fit, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I chalked it up to exhaustion. When you're out there for days on end with nothing but the sound of wind and your own heartbeat, your brain starts trying to entertain itself. You start noticing patterns in the trees. You see shapes in the ice. You think too hard about sounds that don't matter. I eventually drifted off to the soft hiss of my stove. In the morning, I boiled water for coffee and ate a protein bar. While packing up my gear, I walked around the clearing, checking for signs of wildlife. A couple sets of snowshoe hare tracks, a lone fox print, nothing unusual. Then something caught my eye. About 60 yards downhill from a clearing was a single pine tree that stood taller than the rest. Something about it looked off. I trudged down through the snow to get a closer look. As I got closer, I saw what it was. The top section of the tree, maybe 35 feet up, had been sliced off at a sharp angle. Not broken, not splintered. Cut. A clean diagonal cut across the trunk, almost perfectly smooth. I stepped back and stared at it for a long time. I've seen trees damaged by lightning, snapped by wind, even scarred by bears. But this wasn't any of those. There was no burn, no cracking, no natural cause I could identify. This was done by a blade. A long, sharp one. I'm not an arborist, but I've dropped enough trees to know what sawwood looks like. The exposed surface of the cut was grayed over, whether by years, maybe decades. It had been done a long time ago, but that raised 1,000 more questions. Who the hell would climb 30 or 40 feet into a pine tree in the middle of nowhere just to make a cut like that? I walked around the base. No old ropes, no broken climbing spikes, no sign of any gear. It was just cut, and judging by the way it was angled, anyone standing on the opposite side of the tree when they finished the cut would have had it swing right back at their torso. That's not just dangerous, it's suicidal. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just staring at it. My first instinct was to document it. I took out my field book and sketched the tree, noting the direction of the cut and the condition of the bark. Then I flagged the nearest sapling with red tape, so I could find a spot again if needed. But I didn't feel right leaving it at that. Call it curiosity or unease, I don't know, but I wanted to see it up close. Really up close. I walked back to my sled, got my saw, and came back. It took me nearly an hour to cut through the lower trunk, but eventually it gave. The upper section tipped slowly at first, then cracked loud through the woods as it hit the snow. I walked over to examine the cut top, now lying on the ground. The wood at the cut was even cleaner than I expected. No fibers pulled out, no hesitation marks. Just a smooth, deliberate slice. The kind you'd only get with a sharp saw and steady hands. That's when I noticed something else. Just below the cut, about a foot down the trunk, was a set of shallow carvings. 3 straight lines, 2 vertical and 1 horizontal, forming an upside-down T. Not deep, maybe done with a knife. A mark, but not a message. I sat down on a nearby rock and just stared at it. The snow was falling lightly by then, the sky clouding over. That area hadn't seen human activity in a very, very long time. No tras, no cabins, no hunting blains. The only thing nearby was an old trapper's line that hadn't been run in over 30 years. So what was this? Who did it? Why? I didn't have answers. All I had was an old tree, a clean cut, and a mark no one could explain. I packed up, rode back to the ranger station, and logged the coordinates of the tree in my field notes. I included a drawing of the carving and a description of the cut. I sent the report into HQ like I always did. Weeks went by. No one followed up. No one asked questions. Eventually, I let it go too. I had other routes to cover, other fires to watch for, other lonely trails to follow. But every now and then, I think about that tree. Not because it scared me, but because it didn't make sense. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters. I never have, but I do believe in people. And I know the lengths some people will go to when they don't want to be found, or when they want to leave behind something no one understands. That tree, that cut, that mark, it wasn't an accident. Someone went out of their way to do it. Someone climbed up that tree decades ago in the middle of the most inaccessible forest I've ever set foot in and made a perfect, dangerous, deliberate cut. Why? I'll never know. But it reminds me that the forest always keeps its secrets. Some of them we stumble across. Some of them we're not meant to find. And some just sit there for years waiting for someone to notice. That was the last time I ever patrolled Tree Line Ridge. And I never went back. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 10 years now, mostly in the western half of the U.S., bouncing between a few national parks. There's a rhythm you fall into over the years. The seasons blur together. Your feet start to recognize every bend in the trail, and the smell of pine and dust gets into your clothes for good. Most of it is quiet work. Checking permits, fixing broken trail signs, logging tree fall, assisting visitors who overestimated their fitness or underestimated the weather. But some memories never blend into the rest. Some cling to you, and no matter how many miles you walk, they follow you. This one started in the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. I was stationed out of a backcountry ranger cabin near the edge of the wilderness zone. It was remote, no road in for 20 miles. Everything I needed was packed in by mule in the spring, and I'd rotate out every few weeks to restock. That isolation, though, is part of what made the job feel worth doing. These were places few people ever got to see up close. I was doing a solo sweep of the Western Ridge Trails. It was mid-September, late in the season, just before the snow started making things risky at elevation. The trees were already turning. Aspen leaves fell like little golden coins around my boots, and the air had that sharp edge of incoming winter. Hikers were thinning out. Most of the regular backpacking traffic had cleared out by then, and only the experienced late-season folks were left. I had a 4-day loop planned, sweeping 3 backcountry camp zones, checking permits, and clearing any obvious hazards like deadfall or washed-out sections. I always carry a trail log with me, just a little waterproof notepad to mark what I see. I'd been filling it out like usual. A small landslide had taken out part of Switchback around mile 3. A bear had clawed open one of the old food lockers in Zone C, and a solo hiker's tent was still pitched in a restricted zone near the West Fork, despite the fact that camping there had been banned after a rock slide last year. That tent was where things started to feel off. It was a dark green dome style, partially hidden behind some brush about 30 feet off trail. Looked like it had been there a while. Rain had caked the lower edges with dried mud, and there were pine needles and debris all over it. I knocked gently on one of the support poles and waited. Nothing. I called out, stepped around it slowly, and unzipped the door. Inside was a collapsed sleeping pad, a sealed food bag, and a weather-worn backpack tucked neatly in the corner. No sleeping bag, no boots, no personal items that I could see, no journal, no phone, no ID. The bear canister was untouched, still locked. The food wasn't even scavenged. That's what puzzled me. Most people, even careless ones, don't just walk away from camp with nothing. I logged the discovery, took some photos, and added a waypoint on my GPS technically. I could have packed the tent out myself, but I was already loaded with gear, and the park procedure required reporting and tagging abandoned property for a follow-up sweep. I marked the site and moved on, a slight unease creeping into the back of my mind. That night, I camped about 6 miles north of there at a designated ranger pad, just off High Ridge Trail. Beautiful spot, clear sky, stars everywhere, and the kind of silence you can only find deep in the wilderness. But I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, not to noise exactly, just a strange feeling, that kind of edge of sleep awareness that something is near you, even if you can't hear it. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold. Nothing. No movement. My bear bag was still hanging from the pine. The treetops swayed gently in the wind, but the forest floor was still. I turned in a slow circle with my flashlight. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. There were boot prints in the dirt outside my tent. Not mine. I checked. Mine were older, tread flatter, and pointing in and out from the food hang and latrine. These were fresh, crisp, deep in the front like someone had been leaning forward, walking slowly. They came from the south side of the clearing, passed by within a foot of my tent door, and disappeared off into the trees. I followed them for maybe 20 feet before they got lost in the pine needles and shadows. No trash, no movement, just the tracks. Whoever it was had walked right past me in the middle of the night, maybe while I was sleeping. I didn't go back to bed. The next morning, I broke camp early and got moving. I kept replaying the night in my head. Was it just a lost hiker? Unlikely. Who hikes at 2 a.m. without making any noise? Was someone stalking the trail? Hunting? I didn't know. I reached the upper alpine zone that afternoon, craggy, exposed ridges above the tree line. The terrain here turns harsh quickly, and I didn't see another person all day. No boot prints, no tents, just wind and rock. My legs were sore, and I was starting to feel the elevation. Around mile 22 of the loop, I came upon a strange sight. A pile of stones, clearly man-made, stacked beside the trail. It wasn't one of our trail markers. Too sloppy, too tall, maybe 2 feet high, and balanced awkwardly. I paused and checked my map. No official markers here. No known cairns. I didn't like it. It wasn't just a pile. It was what was tucked underneath it. Pressed into the base, beneath the bottom stone, was a small strip of torn fabric. Faded blue, nylon, or polyester. I pulled it out and turned it over. It looked like it had been cut cleanly at one end, maybe a torn strap or a piece of clothing. But it was the color and texture that caught me. It was the same as the sleeping pad I'd seen in the abandoned tent. I bagged the fabric, photographed the pile, and noted the GPS location. I kept walking, but the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't lie down. That night, I camped in a low valley beside a glacial lake. I didn't sleep. I didn't even bother with my tent, just rolled out my pad under a rock ledge where I could see in all directions and hear anything that moved. I kept my radio close and my bear spray closer. Just before sunrise, I heard footsteps. Not wildlife. Not the rustle of a marmot or the thud of a deer. These were human. Soft. Deliberate. A dozen steps or so, crunching lightly across the gravel between the trees near the shoreline. Then silence. I waited. No voice. No flashlight. Just silence again. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe heavy. After 20 minutes of nothing, I stood up slowly, circled the camp, and found nothing. No tracks this time. No prints I could follow. Just a sound I knew I'd heard and the feeling that I was being watched. I finished the last day of the sweep running on adrenaline. My pace was fast, and I checked over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't stop for lunch. I didn't linger at any trail signs. I wanted off that mountain. But the last thing I found kept me from forgetting this trip for the rest of my life. About a mile from the trailhead, as the trees thickened and the air started to warm slightly, I spotted another boot print. This one was clearer, pressed into soft dirt at the edge of a stream crossing. But what made it stand out was what was beside it. A single line, drawn in the dirt with the tip of a stick or boot heel, led from the print into the woods. Like a pointer, like a direction. I followed it. I didn't want to, but I could not. About 100 yards off the trail, through dense brush and over a small rise, I found another pile of stones. Same height, same sloppy shape, but this time something was sticking out of the side. A A bone, a femur, partially buried in dirt, the end cracked and sun-bleached. The stones had clearly been disturbed. Animals maybe, but the bone had been placed under them at some point. On purpose. I called it in, used the satellite radio, gave my location, and waited for the response team. They flew in with a chopper later that afternoon. I flagged the LZ, guided them in, and showed them everything I'd found: the tent, the piles, the bone. Over the next few days, they found more remains. Scattered. Some old, some surprisingly recent. One skull, a few rib bones. Nothing complete, nothing buried. All of it spaced out along that same ridge loop. The conclusion? Foul play likely. Human remains confirmed. Investigation ongoing. No clear ID on most of it. Some bones have been out there for years. The tent? Still a mystery. No matches to missing persons. No fingerprints. No personal effects. And the footprints around my tent? They never found any trace of who or what left them. But I know someone was out there. Not just wandering. Not just camping. Following. Watching. Maybe even hunting. And that's why I don't hike solo anymore. Not out there. Not that trail. Not after dark. Because some trails should stay quiet. And some things, once seen, can't be walked away from. I was 18 when I decided I was ready to try my first solo overnight trip in the woods. I'm from Northern California, and the forests here have always been a part of my life. My dad raised me on hiking trails, and we've done everything from short loops to long, winding backpacking treks through the Sierras. So when I turned 18, I figured it was time to do something on my own. Just one night. No big deal. I had enough experience. I had the right gear, and I picked a place I already knew. It was early summer, around the end of May 2023. The weather had been good that week. Clear skies, a little chilly at night, but nothing I couldn't handle. I decided to go out on a remote trail I'd hiked a few times with my dad. It's not listed on most maps, and that's why I liked it. You won't find it marked with any of the big trail apps, and that makes it quiet. Very quiet. We'd never run into anyone else on it. Not once, even in the daytime. I want to name a trail here, mostly because I don't want to encourage others to do what I did. What I did wasn't legal. This trail passes through an area where camping isn't allowed. It's protected land managed by the Park Service. They don't have a big presence there because of how remote it is, but they've posted small warning signs at the trailhead and a few other spots. No falleres, no camping. I knew all that. I ignored it anyway. My plan was simple. Start early, hike all day, go off trail to a spot I had picked out earlier in the year, camp overnight, and finish the hike the next morning where my family would pick me up at a dirt road. It was all arranged. My dad dropped me off at the trailhead around 7:30 in the morning. He didn't love the idea of me camping solo, but I guess he respected that I wanted to try it. I told him I'd text him once I got reception near the pickup point the next day. That was the deal. I had all the right gear. A lightweight one-person tent, a small propane stove instead of a fire, my sleeping bag, extra layers food, a headlamp, GPS, printed topo map, compass, 3 knives, 1 big fixed-blade buck knife, and 2 folding ones, a first aid kit, and a whistle in case I ran into mountain lions or needed a signal for help. I wasn't going in blind. I'd done this before, just not alone. The hike that day was great. The trail cuts through some really beautiful forested mountains, dense stands of pine and fir, with spots where the canopy opens up just enough to let sunlight paint the forest floor. Everything smelled like warm earth and dry needles. I stopped for lunch on a flat rock near a small creek and just sat there listening to the sound of the water and the wind through the trees. I didn't see another soul all day, which didn't surprise me. That's what I was counting on. By around 5 p.m., I reached the point where I'd planned to leave the trail. The spot I'd picked was maybe 15 minutes off the path, on a little ridge that overlooked a dry creek bed. It was a small open area with a few boulders and 1 tall pine that kind of leaned over the camp. I found it a few months back when I was hiking with my dad. It wasn't perfect, but it was flat, a little sheltered, and hidden enough that nobody would stumble onto it unless they knew exactly where it was. I set up my tent, cooked a hot dinner on the propane stove, just freeze-dried chili and rice, and sat back against my pack while eating. The sun started dipping behind the mountains around 7:30. I didn't bother with a fire obviously because I didn't want to get caught. I just let the daylight fade out naturally. Once it got dark, I climbed into the tent and slid into my sleeping bag. I was tired from the hike, and I figured I'd fall asleep fast. But I didn't. I lay there for a long time, just listening. It's amazing how different the woods sound at night. Every snap, every rustle, it all seems louder. Like the darkness turns the volume up. At some point, I dozed off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. I didn't check my phone. I just remember waking up very suddenly, like something had yanked me out of a dream. At first, I didn't hear anything, just silence. I thought maybe it was just a random wake up. That happens sometimes in the woods. But I kept laying there, eyes open in the dark, waiting. Something felt wrong. I can't explain it better than that. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the feeling, like my body knew something before my brain did. Then I heard it. A single crack, a twig breaking not far from the tent. Sharp and clear. My first thought was deer, or maybe a raccoon. I've heard them before. They could be loud. But then came two footsteps. Slow, heavy, crunching pine needles and twigs. Not fast like an animal scurrying. Steady, deliberate, human. That's when my heart started pounding. I didn't panic. Not right away. I stayed completely still and listened. I reached slowly to the side where I'd left my knife. My hand found a handle, and I gripped it tight. I didn't breathe loud. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just listened. The footsteps came closer, but not directly to the tent. They moved in a slow arc like someone circling. Then they stopped. Dead quiet again. And that's when I heard it. A humming. Deep. Low. Guttural. Not a tune. Not a song. Just a slow hum, like someone trying to keep themselves company in the dark. It wasn't an animal. It was 100% human. My mouth went dry. The humming went on for what felt like forever. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls, and I wasn't about to unzip it and look. I stayed frozen, clutching my knife, heart slamming against my ribs. The humming stayed steady, not loud, not soft, just right there in the air, vibrating through the stillness. Then it stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe they were gone, but I didn't hear footsteps, just silence. Then scratch. A slow, rough scratch on tree bark, like fingernails or maybe a blade dragging down a trunk. It came from just behind the tent, near where that big leaning pine stood. I could picture it in my mind, someone standing there, running their hand or knife down the tree, staring at my tent. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe too hard. Then, all at once, the person dashed off. I heard branches snap, leaves crunch, grass rustle. It wasn't a calm walk away. It was a sprint, a wild, crashing sprint into the woods. And then, silence. I sat there the rest of the night, knife in hand, eyes wide open. I didn't sleep another second. Every creak of the trees, every distant owl, every random noise had me locked in place. I kept expecting the humming to come back. Or worse, footsteps returning. But they never did. As soon as the sun rose and the light filled the tent, I moved. I threw everything back into my pack, didn't bother folding my tent neatly or repacking food properly. I just shoved it all in and got moving. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even drink water until I was halfway down the trail. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way out. Every bend in the trail made my skin crawl. Every shadow looked wrong. I ran sections of the hike, even though I was tired and sore from barely sleeping. I didn't stop until I hit the dirt road where my dad was supposed to pick me up. I called him. He came. I didn't wait for him to ask anything. I just told him everything, start to finish, right there on the side of the road while sitting on my pack. He was quiet the whole time I spoke. Just listened. At the end, he asked one question. Do you want to go to the Rangers? I said no. Here's why I made that decision, and I know some people won't agree with it. First, I couldn't prove anything. I never saw the person. I didn't have a photo. I didn't have a recording. There was no real evidence. Second, and this is the big one, I wasn't supposed to be there. I broke the rules. If I told the Rangers what happened, I'd have to admit that I camped illegally in a restricted area. That's on me. And third, I was scared, not of getting in trouble. Scared of drawing attention from whoever that was. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know if they lived out there, or were just wandering through, or if they had found me by accident. I don't even know if they meant harm. But nothing about what they did was normal. You don't stand near someone's tent in the middle of the night and hum unless you're trying to scare them. Or worse, I haven't gone back to that trail since. I don't plan to. I still hike, but I stick to marked trails now. And I never camp alone. Ever. There's something about knowing a place so well, thinking you've got it all figured out, and then suddenly realizing you don't. I thought I knew those woods. I thought they were mine. But that night reminded me, the forest doesn't belong to anyone. It's big, and it's old, and it doesn't care if you're scared or alone or brave or stupid. And sometimes someone else is out there, too. I don't tell this story often. When I do, I leave some details out. But everything I just told you happened. I remember the sound of the steps, the low humming, the scratching, the sudden crashing of branches as he ran. I remember the fear. I can still feel it now. And the truth is, I think whoever was out there that night knew exactly what they were doing. I've worked as a park ranger in northeastern Wisconsin for nearly 20 years now. And before that, I was just a kid who couldn't stay out of the woods. I grew up in the region, and I never really left. Some people find peace in the trees. I found something deeper, maybe not peace exactly, but something that held me still. Most of my life has been surrounded by timber, bogs, low rolling hills, ice-crusted lakes, and the biting wind that cuts straight through every layer you put on. I've spent so much time out there, days, weeks, sometimes months at a time. People assume that the most dangerous things in the forest are bears or wolves or maybe hunters who don't check their targets properly. Those things exist, sure, but they're not what keep me up at night. What keeps me up at night are the things that don't make sense. It started when I was a kid. I was 12 the first time I really felt something was off in the woods. It was late spring, maybe May. Everything was thawing. Snow had turned to slush, and the trails were muddy. I was doing what I always did back then, wandering by myself, following deer trails, poking around fallen trees. I had an old aluminum frame backpack and my dad's hand-me-down boots that were still too big for me. There was an old beech tree in the lower grove near our family's land. It stood taller than anything around it, bark like pale skin and roots that reached out like knuckles beneath the mud. That's where I found it, the red shoe. It was small, a toddler's shoe, faded, but still a deep red like brick, pressed halfway into the wet ground, right beside one of the roots. The thing about it, what really made my skin crawl, was how out of place it looked. It hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. I came by that spot regularly, and I would have noticed something like that. But now it was sitting there like it had been dropped recently, half submerged, but clean enough to know it hadn't been there long. No other footprints. No signs of play or struggle. Just one tiny shoe and nothing else. I remember just staring at it. I didn't touch it. I don't know why, but I didn't want to. Something in my chest just locked up. A cold, prickling feeling rose through my stomach. Even now, I remember that stillness like the forest had stopped breathing. I backed away, turned, and didn't go back to that grove for weeks. It was the first time I felt unsafe in the woods. As I got older and started working as a ranger, I came to understand that unease better. There are things you see out there that don't make the evening reports. Things you don't mention over coffee with the other rangers. Not because you're hiding anything, but because you don't know what the hell you saw. One spring, about 10 years back, I was hiking a remote section of protected land a little west of Highway 55. I was doing a solo check after some storm damage. A few bridges had been reported washed out, and I had to see what repairs were needed. It was early. I'd left the truck just after sunrise, and the fog hadn't lifted from the valleys yet. That's when I found a garbage bag. Now, you find trash out there all the time. People dump things they don't want to pay to get rid of. TVs, tires, busted furniture. It's infuriating, but it's part of the job. But this bag was different. It was tucked under a massive white pine. And I mean tucked, wedged beneath the roots like someone had intentionally tried to hide it. The bag itself was thick, black plastic, the kind used by professional landscapers. At first, I assumed it was filled with household garbage. But it hadn't been torn open by animals, which is rare. Raccoons will get into anything if it smells even remotely like food. But this bag was untouched. My boots sank slightly as I walked over. Something about the placement made me nervous. It wasn't on a path. It wasn't near a campsite. It was out in the middle of nowhere. I took a stick and poked at it. It was heavy, sloshed almost. I crouched and peeled the top back. Inside were gallon-sized Ziploc bags, dozens of them, each one filled, sealed, and packed in tight rows like someone had taken time arranging them. What hit me next was the smell. Coppery, sweet, familiar, blood, not dried, still fluid, still dark and thick. I didn't move for a solid minute. My mind had already leapt to the worst possibilities. Animal blood? Possibly. Hunters sometimes do weird things, but this was too clean, too deliberate. Gallon after gallon. Ziplocs sealed to the brim. No labels. No markings. Just blood. Who collects that much blood? Why? I didn't touch anything else. I didn't need to. I stood up and backed away the same way I came. I marked the location and radioed it in once I got to a higher ridge, using the excuse of a hazardous material dump for the official report. When we went back with the authorities, the bag was gone. Not torn open, not dragged off, just gone completely. I still think about that one more than I should. And then there was the house. There are abandoned buildings all over these woods. Old logging camps, trapper cabins, forgotten homesteads that haven't seen people in 50 years or more. I love finding them. It's like stepping back in time. I keep a log of them, take photos, sketch out where they are for our records. Some are falling apart. Some are barely more than a few walls and a collapsed roof. But this one was different. I was deep into the wetlands west of the Wolf River. There's a trail that snakes through cattail marshes and skirts the edge of a bluff line before opening into high forest. I'd gone off trail to check an area where some campers had reported strange animal calls, likely coyotes or owls, but we checked those reports anyway. About a mile off the trail, I spotted the house. It didn't make sense. There were no roads out there, no snowmobile tracks, no ATV marks. The brush was thick, but here sat a house that looked like it had been built maybe 30 or 40 years ago. Not old enough to match the other structures I'd seen in the woods, but old enough to feel out of place. Not run down either. The windows were intact. The roof wasn't caved in. There was even a rusted antenna on top, and an old metal TV tower half collapsed behind it. I walked the perimeter first. It was a small house, maybe 2 bedrooms, single floor with a tiny porch and narrow back door. That's where I found my way in. Inside, it was dark, and the air was thick with mildew. Furniture was still there. Couches, waterlogged books, a wooden table covered in dust and mold. I noted the smell of rot and damp insulation. But it was the TV that really stood out to me. It was a 1970s model, wooden frame, dials on the front, the kind I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Not smashed, not gutted, just sitting there like someone had watched it last week. I moved cautiously down the hallway. The first room on the right was empty, just an iron bed frame, the mattress long gone. The second room next to it was different. There was a mattress, not new, but newer than anything else in the house. Still stained and dirty, but without the leaves, cobwebs, or rot that covered the other furniture. What really made me stop was the large Ziploc bag on top of it. It had a new bottle of shampoo, some folded papers, travel-size hygiene products, and what looked like a flashlight. All untouched, all clean. My stomach sank. Someone was living here, and they had likely left not long before I arrived. I didn't freeze this time. My training took over. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make noise. I didn't touch anything else. I walked out the way I came in, retracing my exact steps. I didn't run. Running makes noise. Running draws attention. I moved steadily, quietly, until I was clear of the house and another half-mile into the trees. Only when I was certain no one was following did I radio it in. We never found the person. We returned with a team 2 days later. The bag was gone. The mattress stripped. All signs of someone living there were removed. It was like whoever had been there packed up and vanished without a trace. We searched the surrounding forest, but nothing turned up. No gumps. No fires. No trails. To this day, I think about that house. About what kind of person can live like that. Alone, hidden, and quiet for who knows how long. The winters in that area are brutal. Temperatures drop to -40 or worse. It's not a place you can survive without planning. This person had planned. And I'll be honest, a part of me respects that. Another part of me is deeply unsettled. I never saw them again, never came across any trace of them. I sometimes wonder if they're still out there, moving from one hidden place to another, keeping to themselves, living a life completely outside of society. Maybe they're dangerous. Maybe not. Maybe they're just scared, alone, forgotten. I've learned a lot in my time as a ranger. I've seen bear attacks, search and rescue missions gone bad, people who wandered off trails and didn't come back. But the things that stay with me are quieter: the red shoe, the bag of blood, the hidden house. None of them involved ghosts or monsters. They were just signs of something human, something broken, or something hiding. I still walk the trails. I still check the maps, note the weather, mark the fallen logs. But every now and then, I find myself watching the tree lean just a little longer, listening when the wind goes silent. Because the forest doesn't lie, but it doesn't always tell the whole truth either. And I've been out here long enough to know when something just isn't right. I've worked as a park ranger for almost a decade now, mostly posted around the Lake Tahoe area, both California and Nevada sides. I've seen a lot here: lost hikers, aggressive bears, even some serious accidents involving rock climbing or kayaking, but nothing I've witnessed before since has left a longer lasting imprint on me than what happened on a late summer evening near Chimney Beach. It wasn't a story that made the papers. No one officially filed a missing persons report that night. There was no chase, no shootout, no viral photo, and no body. But it was real, and I think about it every single time I walk down that trail or even hear someone mention Lake Tahoe. This happened 2 years ago on a weekend I wasn't even supposed to be working. It was early September, just after Labor Day. The crowds had thinned out, the air was still warm, but you could feel the beginning of that crispness in the wind, the kind that tells you fall's not far off. I had taken the weekend off to celebrate my sister's birthday. She had flown in from Arizona, where she works as a nurse, and since I lived just under an hour from Lake Tahoe, we decided to spend 2 nights at a small lodge near Incline Village on the Nevada side. We arrived that Friday evening around 7 p.m. Traffic up the mountain was surprisingly light, and check-in went smooth. The lodge was old but clean, the kind of place with wood paneling and faded brochures in the lobby about zip lining and kayaking. I remember feeling a little tired from the work week, but she was excited, chatty, full of that restless energy that some people get when they're on vacation. After dropping our bags off and freshening up, she insisted we go out to the lake, even though the sun was already dipping low behind the mountains. She had read about Chimney Beach, how it was quiet, not too crowded, a bit of a hidden gem. I reminded her that we'd have to hike down a bit to get there, but she didn't care. She had her phone, wanted to take some birthday photos with the lake behind her. By the time we parked the car at the overlook lot and began walking down the path toward the beach, it was around 8:30 p.m. The sun was pretty much gone, leaving behind just the faintest streaks of pink and orange behind the ridge across the water. The trail down is only about 3/4 a mile, but it's steep in parts and uneven. Still, we made it down in about 15 minutes, guided by the flashlight on her phone. When we reached the beach, I noticed how still everything felt. Not silent. There were sounds for sure, but still like the landscape itself was holding its breath. The water was smooth like glass. You could hear the distant sound of people. Maybe half a mile down the shore, a group of teenagers, I guessed, laughing and blasting music from a small speaker. Closer to our left, maybe 200 or 300 yards away, 3 men were packing up, folding up beach chairs, shaking out towels, throwing gear into a cooler. We were alone, technically, but not isolated. Not completely. Still, as we walked to the edge of the water, something about the place felt off. The weirdness started almost immediately. My sister started taking pictures, posing near the water with the dying light behind her. But she kept checking the photos and frowning. I didn't ask her why. I assumed she was unhappy with how dark they were turning out. I walked to the edge of the beach, letting my boots rest on the damp sand. The water was so calm, it looked like a sheet of black metal. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off this gnawing feeling in my gut. It wasn't anything I could name, just a sense that we shouldn't be there. I've worked around this lake for years. I've hiked nearly every trail on both sides. I've slept alone in backcountry cabins and spent nights in fire towers with nothing but the wind and the creak of pine trees to keep me company. I don't spook easy, but something about Chimney Beach that night made my skin feel too tight. I turned around to look at my sister. She was crouched, trying to take a picture of the water from a lower angle. And that's when I realized I felt like someone was watching us. It wasn't a paranoid thought. It wasn't the kind of fleeting, irrational fear that creeps up when you're in the dark. It was a cold, steady certainty. I looked around. No one had walked up behind us. The teenagers' music was still audible in the distance. The three men were gone now. I saw the tail lights of their SUV bouncing as it moved back toward the highway. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. My eyes drifted to the water again. Something about it just felt wrong. It was too still, and I realized that, despite being so close to shore, I couldn't see the bottom. Tahoe is deep, famously deep, but close to shore, you can usually see the stones or sand beneath the surface. Here it was just blackness. Flat, heavy blackness. Then something else hit me. There were no sounds from the water. No lapping wafts. No splashes. No insects. It was dead quiet except for the faint music down the beach and the wind through the trees behind us. My sister called me over to look at a photo she took. I walked over, looked at her phone, and felt something in my stomach drop. In the photo, she was standing in ankle-deep water, smiling with the mountains behind her. But just over her shoulder, in the water, there was what looked like a shape. Not clearly a person or an object, just a dark spot where there shouldn't be one. Almost like something half-submerged. A head? A rock? I couldn't tell. But it hadn't been there when I looked at her just seconds earlier. I didn't want to scare her, so I handed the phone back and said nothing. But inside, I knew we needed to leave. She took a few more photos. I stood with my back to the water, trying to keep an eye on everything at once. I kept imagining something moving behind me, like a ripple or a shift in the light. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see anything. Finally, I told her it was getting cold and we should start heading back up. She agreed. I think she sensed something too, though she didn't say it. We began walking back up the trail, and that's when I felt the strongest urge to run that I've ever felt in my life. It wasn't panic exactly. It was like my body knew something I didn't. Every nerve in my legs wanted me to sprint. My hands were sweating. My ears were straining to pick up sounds behind us. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No rustling. Just that oppressive silence. We made it to the car, locked the doors, and didn't speak until we got back to the lodge. She was quiet that night, didn't post any of the pictures, just went to bed early. I sat up in the little kitchenette with a cup of tea, trying to shake the feeling that we had narrowly avoided something. I didn't know what. The next morning, while she was still asleep, I opened her phone gallery. I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to see that photo again. It was still there, and the shape behind her shoulder was even more visible now that I looked closer. It wasn't a rock. It was shaped wrong. It was too smooth, too round, like the top of someone's head. And now I noticed something else, a faint wake around it, as if it had been moving through the water. Still, that wasn't proof of anything. It could have been anything, a piece of driftwood, even a trick of the light. But I'm not the kind of person who just lets a feeling go, especially when I've felt it that strong. After she flew back home, I went back to Chimney Beach, this time in uniform, fully armed, radio on, and in daylight. I parked in the same lot, hiked down the same trail. The place felt different during the day, but not entirely normal. I walked the shore, scanned the trees, checked the water. I even brought a pair of polarized glasses to see beneath the surface better. I saw nothing, but about 100 feet down the shoreline, wedged between two large boulders, I found something that stopped me cold. It was a worn blue hoodie, half buried in the sand. Faded, sun-bleached, but clearly not old enough to have been there for more than a week. There was still a label inside, size medium. I found no wallet, no ID. Just a zip-up hoodie and a water bottle nearby, half full. There were no footprints around, and no one else was on that section of the beach. I logged it as found property, submitted a report, and asked the sheriff's office to check for any missing persons matching the description. Nothing matched, but I knew in my gut that it belonged to someone who had been there recently, maybe even that night. I've revisited that beach many times since. I've talked to other rangers about it. One of the senior guys, Carl, said something that stuck with me. He told me there are places around the lake that feel wrong. Not haunted, just wrong. Like the landscape remembers something terrible and it never quite goes back to normal after. Chimney Beach is one of those places. I don't tell people this story unless I trust them. I never say there were ghosts. I don't believe in that stuff. But I do believe that some places carry weight. And I believe we came very close to something that night. Something human, something real. I think someone was in that water watching us. Maybe hiding, maybe waiting. And I think they were the reason for that silence. That stillness. That feeling in my gut that made every hair on my body stand up. The police never followed up. There was no case. No answers. But I'll never forget how it felt to stand on that beach, surrounded by nothing, and feel like something wanted us to stay. Permanently. I've worked as a park ranger in Northern California for going on 15 years now. I've done shifts in Lassen around the Klamath Range and spent time bouncing between the Shasta Trinity area and other stretches of wilderness not too far from the Pacific Crest Trail. I've seen all kinds of things. Strange animal behavior. Campers who should have never left their cars. Wildfires that crept in faster than anyone expected. But one week in the backcountry, a few miles north of Mount Shasta, has stayed with me more than anything else. And I still don't have a neat explanation for it, even after all this time. This happened about 5 years ago. I had volunteered to do a week-long backcountry patrol. No real emergency, just a routine sweep to check conditions on some remote trails that don't get as much traffic, confirm any trail damage, look out for fire hazards, and log camper presence. I packed my gear, planned for about 6 nights out, and arranged my exit on the other side of the section. I was familiar with this stretch of land, and since most people don't like hiking it alone, it's usually quiet. I didn't expect to run into more than a few solo hikers, maybe a small group or two. The third night is when things started to feel strange. I had made decent ground during the day. Nothing dramatic. The weather had been kind, cool, a little cloudy. I passed a group of 3 hikers headed southbound and waved them off. They told me they'd camped farther down, near a spot that offered full 360-degree views of the valley below and surrounding mountains. They said it was one of their favorite stops. I made a mental note and decided that would be my spot for the night too. I'd never camped there personally, but had heard other rangers talk about it. They weren't lying. It was stunning. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was low but not yet dipping behind the peaks. The sky was glowing gold and pink. I set my pack down and did a slow circle. You could see for miles in every direction. Mount Shasta stood like a giant to the south, slightly clouded by mist, and the valley below was thick with forest, untouched wild. No roads, no cabins, just trees folding into more trees. I pitched my tent quickly while I had light. I set up my little cooking station nearby, made some food, dehydrated rice and beans, and drank the last of my filtered water before heading a few hundred feet down to refill from spring I knew. Once everything was in order, I sat down on a flat rock facing the open valley and watched the rain fall softly over the distant flanks of Mount Shasta. It was one of the most peaceful things I'd seen in months. I crawled in my tent just after dark. It wasn't fully black outside yet, but I was tired. I left the vestibule open so I could lie on my side and still see out toward the valley. I do that sometimes, watch the sky until my eyes close. The cool air smelled clean. Pine, damp earth, something faintly metallic like wet stone. I didn't bother with my rain fly. It didn't look like the weather would come this far north. That's when I noticed it. A white light, maybe a quarter-mile away, low in the valley, but visible through a clearing in the trees. It wasn't moving fast, just hovering, or maybe just stationary. At first, I thought it could have been a cabin. But I'd studied the maps out here. I had a copy of every registered structure in the zone. No buildings out there, not even a fire watchtower. And there were no access roads in that direction for at least 10 miles. It was just wilderness. Still, I wasn't alarmed. I figured it could have been a hiker with a bright lamp, maybe a solo camper with one of those heavy-duty battery lanterns. Those things glow for hours. I watched the light for a while, then turned on my side, zipped my sleeping bag, and try to relax. I didn't want to fixate on it. I was alone out here, and I've learned not to chase ghosts when you're tired. Besides, I had a long stretch of trail ahead the next day. But I opened my eyes again maybe half an hour later, and the white light was still there. Only now, there was another light. This one was orange and moving in slow, wide circles around the white one. The motion was smooth, constant, and I could see, even from that distance, that it wasn't a beam. It was glowing, but in a pulsing, fluid way. The orange color shifted, sometimes soft amber, sometimes almost red, like embers under glass. And it changed shape. It didn't flicker or stutter. It just flowed around the white light like it was orbiting it. It felt hypnotic to watch. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. If someone was hiking with a headlamp, why would they be circling? And why such a strange glow? There were no trails down there. No open land to walk clean circles in. It was dense forest, thick underbrush, steep slope. You couldn't walk in an arc even if you wanted to. I kept watching, trying to reason through it. Maybe someone had set up a device, some kind of LED rig. Maybe someone dropped a drone. But no drone I've ever seen hovers like that for hours without making noise. And it didn't dart around. It was graceful, slow, and almost too smooth. Rain started around midnight. Soft at first, then steady. I pulled on my rain fly and zipped it mostly closed, but left a little corner open to keep an eye out. Both lights were still there. The orange one continued its dance around the white one. I felt a chill crawl into my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. I kept waking up in intervals through the night. Every time I checked, the lights were still there. No change in their distance or movement. Just constant. At 4 a.m., I got up to pee. It was still raining lightly, and the lights were still exactly where they had been. I stood there, half asleep, wet cold, staring out into that thick, dark valley. I tried filming on my old handheld camcorder, but all I got was a blurry mess of pixels and shadows. Nothing clear enough to show. By dawn, the lights were gone. I looked the minute the sun crested over the horizon. Nothing. I waited another hour. Still nothing. The area they had been in looked no different from the rest of the forest. Trees, mist, soft slopes running down into a ravine. I packed up and hit the trail. I didn't speak. I didn't whistle. Something in my chest felt tight. 2 days later, it got worse. I was hiking mid-morning along a stretch that cuts near the Shasta Trinity boundary. Thick forest on both sides. The kind where the trees block out the light, even when the sun's high. It's quiet there. No wind, no water noise, just the sound of your boots and your breath. I was moving at a steady pace, trying to cover a lot of ground. I hadn't seen anyone in nearly 24 hours. About 100 feet ahead of me, and slightly to the right, I noticed something strange. A thick patch of brush low, about chest high, was being flattened in a straight path, fast, as if something was charging through it parallel to the trail. I stopped cold. Whatever it wasn't small. It wasn't a squirrel or a deer. It was pushing entire limbs aside. Thick stems and bushes bent with weight and snapped. The movement was fast, direct, and heading right toward where the trail would intersect it. I know what a bear sounds like. I've encountered at least 20 in my career. Black bears are common here. But this wasn't like the times when a bear rummaged or darted off. This movement was controlled, deliberate, like a predator hunting something. I froze and shouted one word out loud. Stop! And it did. Instant silence. Like someone hit a mute button on the forest. I couldn't even hear my own breathing for a moment. The movement stopped instantly. Not slowly. Not with hesitation. Like it understood me. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my bear spray or my knife. I just stood there and stared at the spot where the brush had stopped rustling. Nothing moved. Not a twig. No breathing. No es nortin. Just nothing. I waited. After about a minute, I decided I wasn't going to stand still all day. I started walking forward slowly, keeping my head turned slightly toward the flattened area. As I walked by, I spoke in a low voice, not because I was trying to be funny, but because it felt right. I said something like, I'm walking through now, just passing by. No trouble, just moving on. I didn't hear a response. I didn't expect one, but nothing moved again after that. I kept walking. After another 10 minutes, I stopped and looked back. Nothing was behind me. No prints. No crash through the trees. The silence returned, and the trail stretched forward like nothing had happened. I kept thinking about how strange that whole valley felt. I've been in loud forests. I've been near rivers, on windy ridges, even slept under helicopters fighting wildfires. But Northern California has this stillness. When the wind dies and there's no bird song, it feels like the trees are holding their breath. I finished the patrol, logged the usual trail maintenance issues, reported fallen trees, erosion damage, a collapsed bridge railing near Switchback. When I got back, I wrote a short note in my patrol log about the lights. Nothing dramatic, just Asterisk observed 2 stationary lights in Lower Valley, white and orange. No known structure in vicinity. No weather anomalies reported, asterisk. I didn't mention the movement in the brush. That kind of thing gets chalked up to nerves or standard bear behavior. But I know what I saw, and I know what I didn't see. Over the years, I've spoken to other rangers and hikers who've passed through that same stretch of trail. Every now and then, someone says something about how NorCal feels off. They talk about I've been working as a part-time ranger in South Carolina for just over 3 years now. My area includes a decent-sized forest that borders a few private properties, including the one where I live. The forest itself is beautiful, wide, dense, and mostly quiet. It's the kind of place that teaches you to respect nature. You learn where not to step, when not to wander too far, and when it's time to leave. It was Friday, March 21st, 5 days ago. My cousin had come over for the weekend. He's younger than me by about 8 years, and we're close, always have been. We've been talking for a while about doing a simple day camping trip out behind my house. There's a tree line about 50 feet from my back porch. That forest runs deep, and we both spent years exploring it. We knew the terrain. At least we thought we did. That night, we stayed up late in the living room going over gear, snacks, and how we wanted the day to go. It was nothing serious, just 2 guys planning to get out, build a makeshift survival shelter for fun, maybe cook something over a fire, and come home before dark. I woke up the next morning around 9:30 a.m. Light was streaming through the blinds. My cousin was still out cold on the couch, wrapped in a fleece blanket. I kicked him awake, and we both got up, excited like little kids. We stuffed our packs with everything we needed: a small hatchet, camping knives, lighter, power bars, jerky, bottled water, a basic first aid kit, paracord, and a weatherproof tarp. By 10:15 a.m., we were standing at the edge of the forest, looking in. The air had a bite to it, a lingering chill from the early spring weather, but the sky was clear. No wind, just bird song and the crunch of our boots as we crossed the threshold into the trees. Here's something worth knowing. 6 months ago, a storm tore through this region. Tornado winds, heavy rain, and flooding. The forest behind my house had taken a serious hit. Trees were uprooted. Some areas were still flooded. Trenches had formed, deep scars in the land, about 5 feet wide and 5 feet deep in places. You couldn't walk 5 yards without having to climb over something. Running? Forget it. If you tried to run through this place, you'd snap an ankle within 10 seconds. Everything was a mess of fallen logs, slick mud, and sharp underbrush. We'd only made it about a mile in before the trees got thicker. The storm damage was worse than I remembered. We passed through 2 old campsites we used as kids, but they were barely usable now. Just flattened dirt and torn up vegetation. After maybe another 20 minutes, we came across a small flat area surrounded by high trees and dense brush on 3 sides. It looked dry. There was a fallen tree nearby we could use as part of the shelter structure. We decided this was the spot. We spent the next 2 hours building. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. We used branches to create a frame, secured it with paracord, and stretched the tarp across the top for a roof. We layered pine branches and leaves to insulate it and blocked the open sides with more branches and bark. It was the kind of shelter you could survive in overnight if you had to. But there were these noises. It started small. Every few minutes, we'd hear a hollow sound, like someone striking a tree with an axe. Thwack, then silence. A few minutes later, another. It wasn't fast or rhythmic. Just one thump, then nothing for a while. We assumed it was something falling. Maybe a broken limb, finally giving out after hanging loose for months. But the sound kept coming, always from the same general direction, maybe 50 to 70 feet off near a small creek that runs downhill from the campsite. Then came the splashing. At first, I thought it was an animal in the water, but it didn't sound random like that. The splashing was intentional, measured, like someone stepping in and out of the water slowly. One splash, silence. Then another, maybe a minute later. I looked at my cousin at one point and saw he was already glancing in that direction. Neither of us said anything. We've been out here so many times, we both knew the sounds of this place. This wasn't deer. It wasn't raccoons. Something or someone was back there. I told myself it was just another hiker, maybe someone with a hunting permit, maybe a surveyor, maybe just someone messing around at the creek. Still, I started to feel protective. I didn't want to leave my cousin alone for even a minute. Around 12:45 p.m., we started adding finishing touches to the shelter. I was working the roof, trying to add another layer of pine branches for coverage. My cousin was working the lower frame, adding sticks and bark to help seal up the wind. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the sound of a branch breaking or someone stepping in mud. It was a human voice. Not words. Not yelling. It was the kind of sound people make when calling a dog. A strange cooing, like PSS, or a whispering Semir but drawn out, gentle, almost playful. I froze. I was standing on the edge of the shelter frame, half crouched, arms up, branch in hand. I just stared in the direction the sound had come from. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Not loud, just enough to reach my ears. What was the tone that got to me? It didn't feel like someone who was calling for help. It felt like someone who was pretending to be harmless. Someone who wanted to seem non-threatening, but was watching us. I dropped the branch and stood up. I didn't say anything to my cousin. I didn't want to freak him out. Instead, I calmly told him to start watching the woods while I packed our things. I didn't explain. I just gave him a job and kept my voice steady. He did what I asked. I grabbed our gear and double-checked everything. I slung my pack over my shoulder, kept the small hatchet in my hand, and told him to start walking. He knew the forest better than I did at this point. He'd spent more time out here recently. I told him to lead, and I stayed behind him by a few feet. I made sure nothing and no one came up behind us. We moved quickly, but carefully. There was no path, just fallen logs, ditches, mud, and thorns. Every 30 seconds, I'd glance over my shoulder. Nothing, just woods. Sunlight through the branches. Still air. Then about 5 minutes into our walk back, I saw him. He was standing between two trees, maybe 20 feet back from where we'd just been, dressed in all black. Thin build, maybe 6 feet tall. Pale hands, black gloves, black cargo pants, black hoodie, and a mask. White, smooth, blank like something from a costume store. I didn't stop walking. I didn't run. I didn't tell my cousin. I just kept moving forward and told him, calmly, to pick up the pace. We were about 30 minutes from home, maybe more given how rough the terrain was. I kept my cousin ahead of me at all times. I looked back once more a few minutes later. He was gone. For a while, I told myself I imagined it. Maybe my brain played a trick on me. Maybe it was just fear. But my gut told me I had seen someone. And worse, I knew he'd seen me too. We kept moving. No bucks. No talking. Just the crunch of our boots and the scrape of branches against our clothes. Eventually, we got within 100 feet of the tree line near my house. I could see the faint outline of my backyard fence through the trees. Sunlight was pouring through, bouncing off the house windows. It looked like safety. That's when I saw movement to my right. A blur of black between the trees. Not walking, running. Darting. Moving from one tree to another, then pausing. Watching us. I didn't look directly at him. Just kept walking. I didn't want him to know I'd seen him. I didn't want to panic and make my cousin panic. But my heart was hammering in my chest. I was sweating, even though the air was cool. We broke the tree line at a fast pace and ran the rest of the way across the backyard. Once we were inside my house, we locked every door and shut every blind. Only then did my cousin turn to me and say, "Did you see him running through the trees too?" I nodded. We didn't go back out that day, or the next, or any day since. 3 days ago, I went back out. Not deep, just enough to check the edge of the forest. I took binoculars and scanned the area where we built the shelter. I couldn't see anything, but later that evening, I hiked a bit along the outer perimeter. Found something odd. Footprints. Deep ones. Boot treads. Not mine, not my cousin's. They were fresh, still holding shape in the mud. They led away from the forest, then curved back in like someone had circled the area. Watching, I reported it to my ranger station. Logged it as a suspicious encounter with an unknown person near a campsite. Since then, we've posted signs warning about unauthorized personnel entering the area and advised local homeowners to avoid going in alone. But I know what I saw. We were 20 feet from death that day. I'm sure of it. Something was wrong with that man. People don't follow strangers through the woods in a mask, silently stalking them for over half an hour unless they're planning something bad. And we would have never known he was there if I hadn't heard that one sound. That strange, almost playful call, like he wanted to lure us in, like he was waiting to see what we would do. I still think about it at night. Sometimes I wake up and check the back window, just to make sure there's no one standing at the edge of the trees. So far, there hasn't been, but I won't ever step foot into those woods again without backup. And I've been a National Park Service backcountry ranger for almost 9 years now. Spent time in Montana, New Mexico, up north in Olympic, and most recently, out here in southeastern Utah. Desert country, red rock, and sagebrush country. You can walk for miles without seeing another soul. And some days that's the best part of the job. Other days, it's the worst. This happened last summer, mid-June. Heat waves were already rolling off the canyons by 9 a.m., and nighttime, temps barely dipped below 70. Long days, hot sun, cold nights if you were too high up. The tourists mostly stuck to Arches and the northern district of Canyonlands. The Needles district to the south didn't get as much traffic. It's more remote, more rugged. Fewer paved roads, fewer trails, and a hell of a lot more places to disappear into. I was working a solo rotation out of the Needles outpost, about a 10-minute drive from the visitor center and tucked just outside the park's southeastern boundary. That week I was handling backcountry patrols and general visitor welfare, checking permits, topping off water jugs, cleaning up illegal fire rings. Stuff like that. Occasionally, I get calls from landowners whose properties bordered the park, usually about poachers or hikers cutting across where they shouldn't be. It was one of those calls that kicked this whole thing off. The call came around 10:30 a.m. on a Thursday. Landowner named Harris owned a huge piece of scrubland that backed right up to the border of the Needles. Said he ran a sort of primitive campsite on his land. No power, no bathrooms, just space to pitch a tent. He mentioned a solo camper had paid to stay on the far edge of his land, right near where his property ended and BLM land began. He wasn't calling to report anything specific, just wanted to let us know that someone was camping alone out there, close to the boundary line. Normally, that wouldn't warrant more than a note in our morning log, but the way he said it stuck with me. She's out there by herself, set up real close to the brush, right by the cutoff to Devil's Pocket. You might want to keep an eye out. I asked him what he meant. He said nothing more, just hung up. I figure it wouldn't hurt to swing by, not to interfere, just to check from a distance. Make sure the camper had water, wasn't building fires, wasn't accidentally over the property line. That kind of thing. I loaded up my pack, filled my bottles, and took my service truck as far as the road would let me. From there, it was about a 1.5-mile hike across dry washes and soft rock. Around 4 p.m., I found the tent. Canvas style, tan-colored, set up smartly in a shaded pocket near some low junipers. Looked like she'd staked it down well. Caught visible through the flap. No fire ring, no trash. Just a low chair, a rolled sleeping bag, and a small food tote tied up in a hanging bag over one of the pinions. I didn't want to startle anyone, so I kept my distance and just watched for a few minutes from behind a rock. The woman, mid to late 20s from the look of her, was lying on her back on the cot, just staring up at the sky. I could see her hands laced over her stomach. Looked peaceful. I didn't want to ruin that, so I left her alone. The next day was quiet. I hiked into Salt Creek early, logged a few miles, and checked out a reported water source that had dried up. Got back late afternoon. I didn't think about the camper again until I got another call that night. It was Harris again. This time, he sounded different. "You get eyes on that woman yesterday?" he asked. I said yes. "She's still there." I paused. "Far as I know." He exhaled, slow and heavy, like he'd been holding something in. "You should go talk to her." "What?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. "She might have seen something last night." That's all he said. He hung up again. So the next morning, Saturday, I headed back out. It was still early, around 7:45 a.m. when I made it to the site. The sun was just starting to warm the rock, but the air still had that crisp, dry bite you get right before a scorching day. The tent was zipped up. The chair was still out. Cot was folded now. No one in sight. I called out a quiet "Park Service" just to be courteous. No response. Didn't want to intrude, so I left a small, laminated ranger card on one of the tent stakes and moved on. Figured she'd come find me at the outpost if she needed anything. By mid-afternoon, I was back at the outpost, refilling the cistern and going through a few maintenance checklists when the woman showed up. She looked off. I mean, her eyes were alert, but her skin was pale. Desert wind will dry a person out, but this was different. She looked shaken. Not lost, not injured. Just like she hadn't slept. At all. She didn't ask for water. She didn't even introduce herself. Just handed me the laminated ranger card I'd left. "Were there any meteor showers last night?" she asked. I told her no, that the next big ones weren't expected until late July. She asked if there were photographers known to come into the park at night. Night photography was common, I said, but not that deep in the backcountry. Most people stuck to the overlooks, and everyone knew not to use flash. It ruins exposures and ruins the view for everyone else. She didn't say anything, just stared past me, toward the rock wall behind the station. After a second, she handed me her phone. "No signal out here," she said, "but I took a picture last night." I looked. The image was black except for a single sharp, flaring orb right in the center. It looked exactly like a camera flash. Bright, white-hot at the center and tapering to a blue rim on the edges. The light bloomed outward in that telltale pattern. The kind of photo you get when the flash goes off too close to the lens. She said it had happened multiple times. Always a few seconds apart. Always moving around her tent. Sometimes right next to it. I asked if she'd heard anything. Footsteps, voices, vehicles. She shook her head. Nothing. Just the flashes. I asked her if she wanted me to walk her back to the site. She said no. She was packing up. Then she asked me a question I'll never forget. "Has anyone ever camped out here and gone missing?" I told her the truth. That yes, it had happened, but very rarely, and never this close to private land. She nodded, turned, and hiked back out the way she came. By the time I made it to the edge of Harris's property that evening, she was already gone. But her tent was still there. Everything else was gone. Sleeping bag, food tote, cot, personal gear, but the tent remained half collapsed, the front zipper slightly open. Inside, I found nothing but a folded map of the park and a red LED headlamp. That night, I stayed out there. I set up my own tent about 30 yards from where hers had been and waited. The moon was high. The stars were vivid. I kept the tent flap cracked and my boots on. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just after 3:30 a.m., I saw it. A flash, directly east. Not overhead, not atmospheric, ground level, and close. Not a lightning flash, not a phone screen. A full, pulsing double pop of light. The kind that lights up the dust in front of you for a second and leaves a dark spot in your vision. I'd seen enough camera flashes to know. I got on my tent quietly, staying low. Didn't turn on my flashlight. Didn't make a sound. Another flash, this time to my left. Then another, a bit further off. I waited, crouched low behind a boulder. My eyes scanned the dark for movement, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no engine hum, no crunch of gravel. Just these intermittent flashes, each one from a different direction. Then I saw one go off maybe 15 feet from my tent. That's when I called it in. I had my radio on me, and I kept my voice low. I asked dispatch to send a sheriff's deputy to the Harris Property Access Road and to bring thermal imaging if possible. Then I waited. The flashes stopped around 4:45 a.m. Dawn was starting to push up over the cliffs, and the shadows began to stretch longer and longer. By the time the deputy arrived, it was full daylight. He brought a drone equipped with IR, and we swept the area. We found nothing. No tracks, no gear, no people. But we did find something else. About 200 yards southeast of my tent, just across the property line and inside park boundaries, we found a series of small reflective discs tucked under rocks. Almost like trail markers, but placed flat, facing the sky. 10 of them, in a loose circle. Each one had a piece of what looked like mirror-polished aluminum or coated glass. They weren't park issue, and they weren't amateur gear either. We flagged the area and brought in a federal investigator the next day. What we learned was that those discs were part of a passive detection grid, used in some forms of low-light surveillance. The kind that doesn't rely on standard trail cams or sensors. The kind that works off triangulation. Essentially, someone had built a primitive but effective perimeter system and had been testing it with remote camera flashes. That's what the woman saw. The flashes. They weren't just random, they were methodical. They were tracing the area, mapping light bounce, angles, maybe even practicing low-profile surveillance at night. And she'd camped right in the middle of it. We never found the cameras, just the reflectors. Over the next month, we did find 2 more similar setups deeper in the backcountry. One near Butler, Washington, another not far from Squaw Flat, all in places without permit logs, all abandoned. No footprints, no discarded. I was assigned to Glacier National Park in Montana during the middle of summer, and by that time, I'd already done a few seasons in other western parks. Glacier was different. It was wilder, quieter in some ways, but also far more unpredictable. The terrain itself didn't intimidate me as much as the silence between the wind gusts. There was something uneasy about how still it could get between the sudden changes in weather. By the time July rolled around, I'd been in Glacier for over 2 months. My assigned patrol area included a few of the more remote campgrounds where tourists often felt like they were out in untouched wilderness, which they almost were. One of these sites was near the eastern boundary of the park, not far from land owned and lived on by a native family. The family ran a sort of primitive camp business for visitors. No electricity, no plumbing, just flat ground, fire rings, and a beautiful stretch of untouched woods. I respected them. They were generous with visitors and always careful about what they allowed on their land. I had spoken with the hosts once during orientation. They had lived on that land for generations. One of them, a middle-aged man with deep wrinkles and a voice like gravel, had mentioned that some parts of the area were burial grounds. Nothing formal, no headstones or wooden crosses, just land, raw and untouched. The park technically bordered their property, and some older trails crossed over loosely marked boundaries. They had never complained about visitors using the campground, but they did ask us rangers to keep an eye out for people wandering off trail, especially near a wooded ravine that ran past both our land and theirs. It was during my 3rd overnight patrol of that area that things started to go sideways. I usually rotated between different areas, doing quick hikes, checking permits, making sure people had bear spray, that sort of thing. But this time, I was doing a 2-night camp to respond quicker to reports of unpredictable weather and a few incidents involving noise disturbances. I'd parked the service truck at the lot around 4:30 p.m. and hiked the half-mile to the campground. The place was quiet, the smell of pine thick in the air. The sound of a creek running just beyond the trees helped mask the ever-present noise of distant wind. About 4 or 5 groups were staying there, typical campers. Couples, hikers, 2 small families. One couple, maybe late 20s, had one of those rooftop tents mounted on their Jeep. I remember it clearly because it was parked almost perfectly level at the end of the campground, close to the tree line, with a ladder tucked neatly against the passenger side. The hosts were set up at the adjacent site and seemed friendly. I didn't spend much time talking, just basic check-ins and a quick scan of the area. I logged the names and plate numbers, gave a usual bear safety talk to a group of hikers, and then retired to my own camp, which was another 1/4 mile out of sight, uphill and more central for ranger patrols. We don't stay with the campers themselves, mostly for liability reasons, but we're always close enough to be useful. That night, a storm came through around 2 a.m. Montana storms don't build gradually. They arrive like a wall. No warning. The wind hit hard and fast, snapping branches and lifting the edges of my tarp. My tent rattled under the pressure, and I could hear debris hitting the fabric. I barely slept through it, but it didn't concern me much. I was used to bad weather. The next morning, I made rounds to check on everyone. Most people were bleary-eyed and cold, but otherwise fine. The couple with the Jeep-mounted tent caught my eye. They looked tired. The guy especially. He had that drawn, heavy-lidded look like he hadn't slept at all. I figured it was the storm. A vehicle-mounted tent has height, but no insulation. It must have felt like they were inside a soda and being shaken by the wind. I made a quick note and moved on. That day, nothing unusual happened. I hiked a few miles, checked the Eastern Ridge trails, and verified that a group of older backpackers had made it to the East Station on schedule. The usual radio check-ins, supply run, and a sandwich eaten on a stump. That evening, I walked back to the campground to observe from a distance and do a light patrol, mostly out of boredom. That's when I noticed something odd. About 20 yards from the couple's Jeep, near the brush line, I found faint prints in the dirt. I almost missed them at first because the ground was dry and dusty. They looked like small shoe prints, children's maybe, but the site had no kids under 16, and I knew that for a fact. I'd logged every permit and walked through each site personally. I looked closer. The prints didn't lead anywhere. They just scattered back and forth like someone had been pacing quickly. That didn't sit right. Most kids wander. They don't pace. They don't go back and forth in a straight line. I checked with the hosts again. They confirmed their children were older teenagers, none younger than 17. No young families were staying nearby. I didn't mention the prints. It could have been from earlier campers. Could have been nothing. I didn't want to cause a stir. That night, I stayed alert. I didn't sleep much. Around 1:30 a.m., the wind picked up again, less intense than the night before but steady. My tent held up. I heard the usual tree creaks and an occasional owl. But around 3 a.m., I caught a sound I couldn't explain. Light steps, fast, moving across dry ground. I got out of the tent quietly, grabbed my flashlight, and stood just outside. My boots sank slightly in the pine-needled soil. I listened. There was again. Footsteps. Small. Sharp. Running. They circled just downhill from me, near the campground. I moved slow. No sudden movements. I didn't call out. Protocol discourages us from startling potential intruders, especially in darkness. When I reached the edge of the tree line, I scanned the area with my light. Nothing. But the moment I shut it off, I heard the sound again. This time it was faster, running in short bursts, stopping suddenly, then starting again. Always small footsteps, always on dry earth. I crouched and watched for a while. 10, maybe 15 minutes. Then nothing. The following morning, I made my rounds again. The Jeep couple looked exhausted. The guy didn't say anything, but the woman kept glancing into the woods while packing up. I got the impression they weren't staying another night. Then something else happened. The girlfriend of one of the other campers, friends of the hosts, approached me mid-morning. She looked uncomfortable, maybe even embarrassed. She asked if there were kids playing around their tent last night. I told her no, gently, and asked what she heard. She said it sounded like running, like a child or small person darting back and forth between the tents. She said at one point, she heard the zipper to their tent start moving like someone was trying to open it. She yelled, and the sound stopped. No response. No one ran away. It just stopped. That got my attention. I didn't tell her that 2 other campers had already heard something similar. I just nodded and told her I'd check the perimeter again. That's when she said something I didn't expect. She said she'd grown up near native land in Arizona and that she knew what small footsteps in the dark could mean. She didn't explain further, and I didn't ask. People have their beliefs. My job was to deal with facts. I spent that whole day doing a deep sweep of the surrounding area. I found more small footprints, this time on the other side of the creek, partially pressed into soft mud. They were fresh, probably within hours. But again, they didn't lead anywhere. They curved back on themselves like someone pacing or standing still and shifting their weight. The tracks were too small to belong to any adult camper I'd seen, and no signs of animals matched the shape. Around noon, the couple with the Jeep packed up and left early. Then the friend group started packing. Only the host stayed, and even they seemed quieter than before. I thought about telling them what I'd seen, what I'd heard, but I couldn't figure out how to bring it up without sounding like I was trying to pin something on their family. So I stayed quiet. That night, I didn't camp. I went back to the ranger station early. Something about the footprints, the pacing, the odd behavior, the way it all seemed to happen around windstorms, it got under my skin. I started going through past incident logs. Glaciers got decades of them. Most are mundane. But about 6 years back, I found a report from another ranger, someone assigned to the same region. He noted that 2 campers complained about someone small running around at night and rustling their tent zippers. No follow-up was ever filed. Just a note in the margin that said, "Kids," with a question mark. 2 nights later, I went back to that site. It was empty. The wind picked up again around 1 a.m. I stayed awake in my tent, listening. The woods felt like they were holding their breath. Then it started again. Quick steps, darting, back and forth. I didn't move. I just sat there, letting the noise come to me. At one point, something approached my tent. I felt the shift in pressure when a foot landed on the edge of my footprint mat outside. Then nothing. No sado. No voice. Just a low howl of wind. By morning, no prints. The wind had cleared them. Or maybe they weren't there at all. I don't know. But here's what I do know. Every time a strong wind came through that canyon, someone or something moved through the campground silently. Always small. Always fast. Always around tents. I started thinking about what the host family had told me. That their ancestors were buried on this land. And that it mattered deeply to them. I believe them. I grew up in the English countryside, in a place that sat on the border between rural farmland and a thin strip of unmanaged forest. It wasn't a proper forest, more like a boundary line where fields ended and trees began, used more by dog walkers than by anyone with any serious business. As a kid, I didn't think much of it. The fields are where we played football in the evenings, where we'd chase each other, climb bales of hay, or just sit and eat crisps with muddy hands. My house backed onto those fields, and beyond the hedges, just over a small rise, the trees began. It was quiet almost always. Sometimes you'd hear the tractors on distant farmland, or the bark of a dog echoing through the woods, but that was about it. When I was about 13, a mate came over one evening. We were messing around in the fields as usual. It was late summer, the sort of golden hour where everything's backlit and buzzing with midges. We weren't doing anything special, just running around, kicking a ball about, tackling each other to the ground. Nothing unusual. It must have been past 7 when the light really started to drop. The sun was dipping behind the trees, and the shadows from the hedgerows were starting to stretch longer. That's when we spotted something strange. We were sitting on a slope, trying to catch our breath, and I remember clearly the moment we both froze. At the far end of the field, near the tree-line, something moved. It wasn't fast, just a slow, deliberate shift. I thought maybe it was a person at first, a walker cutting across, but then I realized the shape was all wrong. It was tall, not just adult tall. It looked massive, even from a distance, bigger than a man, broader too. It was standing still, facing us, just a silhouette against the trees. No detel, no color, just a shape. And it wasn't on all fours. It was upright. There are no big predators in England. No bears, no wolves. Maybe deer, sure, but this wasn't a deer. It didn't move like one. It didn't even look curious or cautious. It looked like it was just watching, staring. Even though it was about 200 meters away, something about the size and stillness of it triggered something deep in me. A very real, primal fear. That instinct that tells you something isn't right. I remember my stomach turning cold, like my insides dropped. I didn't even say anything. Neither of us did. We just ran, as fast as we could, back to the house, across the field, through the hedgerow, up the garden. We didn't even talk about it afterward. Not properly. And I never played near the trees again, not after dark. Years passed. I left home, went through school, joined a forestry service in my mid-20s. Not because of that one experience, though it probably played some role. I liked the outdoors. I liked order in the wild. I worked in conservation areas, helped with trail maintenance, wildlife monitoring, logging permissions, fire safety patrols. The usual. I was posted all around the country over the years. Mostly in national parks, Snowdonia, Brecon Beacons, even the Yorkshire Dales for a stint. but I didn't return home often. Not until my early 30s when I transferred to a district near where I grew up. It wasn't exactly the same area, but close enough. Familiar. That was when the old memory started creeping back in. I didn't want it to. I wasn't a kid anymore, and I'd seen enough in my line of work to know most odd things have boring explanations. Animal movement, heat haze, shadows, perspective distortion, whatever. But still, that cold feeling from the field stuck with me. It lingered. The place I was stationed was small. One main office, a few scattered ranger cabins, and a couple of MARC patrol areas. My assigned sector was mostly lowland woods and fields. It included a small section of unmanaged forest that had been fenced off years back, but was occasionally breached by trespassers. I got a call one day about someone spotting what they described as a large man moving strangely near the woods. That's what caught my attention. Most reports like that turn out to be drunk hikers or poachers. But the phrasing, large man, moving strangely, struck a nerve. So I drove out there the next day, midday. Sun was out, birds were loud, and everything looked exactly as it should. I walked the perimeter, checked for footprints. I did find some disturbances in the undergrowth, but nothing definitive. Still, I marked the coordinates and logged it. Standard procedure. 2 days later, I went back out again, this time later in the afternoon, just to be sure I could see how the area looked during the transition to evening light. And something about it brought me straight back to that moment from my childhood. The long shadows, the way the light caught the tree trunks at an angle, the odd silence that creeps in around dusk. It felt like deja vu. But I pushed it down and continued my round. About a week after that, I was scheduled for an overnight at one of the fire towers just outside the Treeline area. It was mostly just to monitor dry conditions. We'd had a run of high temperatures and the brush was getting dangerously crisp. The tower was a rickety old structure, rarely used anymore, but it still had power, a radio, and enough space to crash for the night. I arrived late in the afternoon, climbed up, set down my kit, and started logging temperatures. Birds were out, everything was still. Hours passed without much incident. The sun dipped, same as before. Around 8 p.m., I spotted movement near the edge of the woods, right where a split fence line allowed access into the restricted area. I pulled out my binoculars. There was something there. Again, not fast, just slow movement, branches shifting unnaturally, as if something heavy was passing through them. I couldn't make out a shape, just the motion of the undergrowth parting, then stopping, then starting again. It wasn't a deer. It was too wide. I knew that. I tracked deer, rabbits, badgers, and boar. This wasn't any of them. It felt deliberate but quiet, controlled. I stayed in the tower for hours, barely blinking. Around 11 p.m., all motion stopped. Not just in the trees, everywhere. No wind, no birds, no insects, just dead silence. That was wrong. Silence like that doesn't happen naturally in the woods unless something has thrown the ecosystem off. Like a predator. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, everything seemed normal again. Birds chirping, light breeze, small mammals skittering along the forest floor. I climbed down, did another sweep around the perimeter, and found something odd, a partial print. Not a shoe, not a boot. Bare. No toes. Toes. Like a human footprint. But bigger, broader, deeper. I logged it. Took photos. Sent them off. I didn't say what I thought it might be. That would have been career suicide. Over the next few months, I started getting more reports. People heard movement at night. They spotted silhouettes near the woods. A few said they felt watched but couldn't see anything. I did more overnights. I took trail cams out, though I knew how unreliable those could be when the light's bad or foliage is thick. Still, I managed to capture something once. A blurred image. Motion triggered. Just a dark shape, upright, passing through the frame. No details. It was enough to get a few others interested. A wildlife biologist came down to have a look. He was polite but skeptical. Said it was probably a large male deer rearing up. I let him say his piece. Then I showed him the bare footprint. His expression changed. He asked if there were known campers squatting in the woods. There weren't. He left without much else to say. Winter came. Things quieted down. Then spring returned, and with it the activity. That's when I decided to stake out the woods myself. No tower, no truck, just me, a tarp, and a set of cameras. I chose a small rise overlooking the area where the prints had been found. I stayed out for 3 nights. The second night was when it happened. I heard it first, around 2 a.m., a soft thump, then a rustle. I waited. Another thump, something heavy stepping through soft ground. I stayed still, barely breathing. I had no flashlight on, just the pale, silver light of the moon through thin branches. I didn't see it at first, only felt it, the sense of something nearby. Then it moved. It stepped out into the faint clearing. I could just make out its shape. Tall, wide, upright. Not quite human, but not animal either. It stood for a moment, maybe sensing me, maybe not. Then it turned and walked slowly back into the trees. I didn't chase it. I didn't photograph it. I didn't move until sunrise. After that night, I submitted a transfer request. I wrote up everything, but left out the speculative parts. I didn't want to sound like I'd lost it. I just said I needed a change of environment. Burnout. It was accepted. I haven't been back to those woods since. And I've never told anyone what I saw. Not in full. I know what I saw wasn't some monster. It wasn't a ghost. It was real. Maybe some wild person living rough for years. Maybe an escaped lab subject from a project that was shut down decades ago. Maybe even something we thought went extinct a long time ago and never did. I don't know. I probably never will. But I do know this. When I was 13, I saw something standing at the edge of the trees. And 20 years later, I saw it again. It wasn't my imagination then, and it sure as hell wasn't my imagination now. I don't go near tree lanes after sunset anymore. I've worn the badge for over 13 years now, patrolling trails most people only see in documentaries or on postcards in tourist shops. You learn early on to respect the land, but more importantly, you learn to respect how unpredictable people can be in the middle of nowhere. Back in 2017, I was stationed in Yosemite, working a seasonal rotation that mostly had me monitoring backcountry permits, clearing trail hazards, and responding to occasional SOS signals from personal beacons. Most of the time, it was peaceful, predictable work. But one story, told secondhand from a hiker I assisted, has stuck with me ever since because I looked into it myself. And what I found still bothers me to this day. It was mid-June. Summer hikers had started rolling in steady. Lots of solo backpackers, long-distance hikers, people with expensive gear and endless playlists on their phones. I had just hiked up near Cathedral Lakes to check on some bear canister violations and was returning back toward Tuolumne when I ran into a guy sitting off-trail, clearly shaken. He wasn't hurt. No obvious injury. But he looked hollow, like he'd seen something he didn't know how to process. His boots were still laced tight, and his gear was packed properly, but he was pale and twitchy, like every branch that snapped in the breeze was about to make him bolt. He didn't need medical help, just space and someone to listen. He told me he'd been doing a solo hike from Lyell Canyon with plans to loop through Bernice Lake and then swing back. On his second night out, he ran into another solo hiker, an older man, mid-40s maybe, with worn gear and the kind of face that said he'd seen a lot more than most people want to talk about. They camped within eyesight of each other and had the usual small talk about water sources, blisters, and backcountry routes. But that night, when they were making dinner, the older guy shared a story that spooked my hiker bad enough to derail his entire trip. He couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't sleep, couldn't even walk alone without feeling watched. This is the story that was told to me. The older hiker said a few years prior, he'd been doing a solo hike through a remote stretch of wilderness in Yosemite's southeastern backcountry, somewhere near Red Peak Pass. He was 2 days into a 6-day loop. Weather was perfect. He'd been averaging around 12 miles a day, crossing granite ridges and weaving through pine basins without seeing a single soul. Around noon that second day, he came up a long ridge lined with scrub and broken shale. The trail curved along a slope before dipping into a shallow canyon. As he came down the ridge and into a clearing, that's when he saw it. A body, a man, lying maybe 15 feet off the trail, slumped against a granite boulder like he'd been placed there on purpose. He wore a full black suit, coat, tie, slacks, polished dress shoes, the whole thing. No hiking gear, no buck. No water, not even a day pack. There was a single bullet wound in the center of his forehead. The skin was still pink, not grayed or bloated from rot. No obvious insect activity yet. Flies hadn't even gathered. It looked like the man had been killed within the last few hours. The hiker said he froze, staring at the suit, the wound, the clean line of the tie against the white shirt. Then he realized how quiet it was. Not just quiet, but dead quiet. No birds, no wind, no insects. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. He scanned the ridges above him, the trees behind him, trying to spot someone. A shooter? Witnesses? He saw nothing, heard nothing, just that silence pressing in. Then came the feeling, strong and fast, that he was being watched. He didn't look through the man's pockets, didn't check for ID, didn't even approach the body. He just stood there, heart pounding, and then he turned and ran. He ran harder than he'd ever run in his life. Downhill, over loose rock and roots, past switchbacks cutting through the trail when it curved too wide. He didn't stop for water, didn't stop for food. He said the worst part was the nights. He hiked straight through the first night, then part of the next day. Camped only when his legs gave out, but couldn't sleep. He said every snap of a twig made his skin crawl. Every branch, shifting in the breeze, became a shadow he couldn't explain. He kept imagining the body getting up and walking, not because he thought it could, but because it felt like something unnatural was happening. When he finally made it back to the trailhead, he drove straight to a ranger station and filed a report. Described the body, gave rough coordinates, waited for a follow-up, but no one ever contacted him again. He called the station a week later. The staff said they had no record of the report. No body had been recovered. No missing person report filed that matched. He said he started to wonder if they were covering it up, or worse, if someone else had found the body and made it disappear. That was the story. Now, to the hiker I was talking to, this was just a spooky tale told over freeze-dried lasagna near a campfire. But something about the details and the older man's demeanor rattled him deeply. He had been confident soloing the loop, but after hearing that, he cut his trip short. He joined up with a group headed toward Vogelsang and exited the backcountry a few days early. Now here's where things took a turn. I couldn't shake that story either. I knew that part of the park. I'd hiked near Red Peak Pass multiple times. It's not a place you'd randomly stumble across wearing a suit. It's hard to get there without effort and planning. And if someone was murdered out there, we would have heard about it. So I started digging. I pulled SAR, search and rescue, reports from the past 5 years. Nothing matched. No solo male hiker found dead in a suit. No missing persons last seen in that area wearing formal clothing. I asked a friend in law enforcement if there were any open homicide cases in the area. Nothing. Then I pulled satellite maps and topo charts for the region between Red Peak and Isberg Pass. There were dozens of unofficial game trails, old fire scars, cliffs, and small lakes that never seemed more than a couple hikers per year. Plenty of places a body could go undiscovered. But what really caught my attention was a helicopter landing site about 8 miles south of the trail. Not a public pad, more of a USFS or NPS utility site used for maintenance and emergency extractions. It wasn't listed on standard hiker maps. You had to know it was there. That got my brain turning. If someone did want to dump a body somewhere, it wouldn't be found, but still accessible enough to reach without backpacking in. Someplace you could chopper into quickly. That area made sense. It wouldn't be easy, but with planning and the right resources, it could be done. Fly in low. Drop the body. Fly out. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't jump at shadows or assume every unsolved story is a cover-up. But this wasn't just a story to me. It was something that stuck in my chest and wouldn't go away. So I put in for some trail maintenance assignments near that region and started exploring off-route. Over the next few weeks, I made 6 separate hikes into that backcountry. Always alone, always alert. I checked ridgelines, searched boulder fields, scanned dry creek beds for signs of disturbance. I never found a body, but I did find something odd on my 4th trip. It was late afternoon. I was hiking near a granite outcrop west of Merced Lake, in an area not marked on any of the park's developed maps. I spotted a scattering of debris near a small stand of trees. Paper scraps, torn fabric, and a small black leather shoe. The kind you'd wear with a suit. There was no tread on it. No manufacturer label. It looked expensive, handmade, but weathered, like it had been out there for a while. Nearby, I found something else, a dark red stain on the rock. Faded now, but still there, about the size of a dinner plate. I marked the coordinates and reported the find. A ranger team came out with cadaver dogs 2 days later, but the dogs didn't hit. No body, no bone fragments, no fresh human scent. The official report called it inconclusive. Debris likely windblown. The stain could have been from an animal, maybe a wounded deer or mountain lion. But I wasn't convinced. I went back one last time that summer. Didn't tell anyone. Took a wide arc past where the shoe had been. Hiked in deeper, near a basin where no official trail goes. That's when I saw it. Buried in a dry gully beneath a collapsed pine was a small metal cylinder, about 2 feet long, olive drab green, military surplus type. It was scratched up, dented, but the markings were still faintly visible. It looked like an old signal flare container or some kind of equipment drop, but it was empty, just lying there miles from anything. No reason for it to be out there. I took photos, reported it again. Again, the answer was the same, no follow-up required. A few months later, I got reassigned to another district. Different mountains, different trails. But that whole story, suit guy, the missing report, the shoe, the flare canister, it's all stayed with me. Here's the thing I've come to believe. The wilderness is full of secrets. Some are natural, weather, terrain, wildlife. Others are man-made. And sometimes, when those two kinds of danger meet in the middle of nowhere, no one ever hears the truth. The older hiker who ran, I believe him. Not just because the details add up, but because I felt that same stillness out there. That's People think being a park ranger is peaceful. Trees, birds, the occasional bear, tourists who thank you for your service. They picture wide open spaces, maybe some solitude, maybe a little danger, but nothing too real. But in the backcountry, far from the paved roads and gift shops, the danger is real. It's not ghosts or monsters. It's weather, terrain, bad judgment, and sometimes people. Back in the summer of 2007, I was assigned a solo stint in the southern part of our forest district, Utah backcountry, about 60 miles west of the Colorado border. It was the kind of place most people wouldn't even find on a map unless you handed them a pen and pointed. We'd had a wildfire roll through earlier that spring. Burned 4,000 acres of lodgepole, ponderosa, and some of the oldest pinyon juniper scrub I'd seen. The fire moved fast, but thankfully no one got hurt. Still, the area had been closed for months. My job was to check the old fire roads, trails, and drainages for downed trees, erosion, any sign that the public might be sneaking in despite the closure signs. Also wildlife. Elk and deer patterns shift after a burn, and bears will dig through the ash for anything edible. It's a long checklist. So they stuck me out there for 2 weeks straight with a pack, a radio, and a beat-up USFS truck. I set up camp near an old Forest Service cabin at Mule Ridge. Not a real cabin, just a one-room timber box built in the 60s for fire crews. No electricity, no water except what came down from a plastic rain barrel. Just a cot, a wood stove, and a mouse problem. I cleaned it up the first day and pitched my tent 20 yards away. I don't sleep in those cabins anymore. Not after Hart's Canyon in '99. Long story. First few days were uneventful. Dry as hell. The sky was bleached white with heat. I'd hike all morning, log any hazards with my GPS, and return by afternoon before the heat cooked my brain. It was quiet. No people. No fresh tire tracks. Nothing alive but a few scrub jays and the occasional mule deer buck watching from a slope like I owed him rent. On day 4, I was hiking down a washed-out 2-track that ran parallel to an old game trail near Goose Jaw Creek. I was about 9 miles from the nearest maintained road. The place smelled like soot and dry pine needles. The wind stirred fine ash into my boots every time I took a step. Then I noticed something off, a shape on the trail. It was a boot, just one, sun-bleached leather. Looked like a men's hiking boot, maybe size 11. Old, cracked laces, no tread left. I walked up to it slowly. Nothing around it. No prints, no drag marks, no animals. Just one boot lying sideways, like someone had stepped out of it and vanished. That was odd enough. But what really made me stop was how clean the inside looked. No burn marks, nowhere on the insole. It didn't match the outside, which was weather hard. Like it had been left there for months, but never filled with rain or dirt. I tagged the coordinates and took a photo with my point and shoot. Figured it might be from a hunter or backpacker who lost gear after the fire, though I couldn't figure how it ended up here without any sign of the owner. It was too early in the season for traffic anyway. I hiked a few more miles, circled back through a gully, then returned to camp by 7 p.m. That night, I barely slept. The wind had picked up and kept rattling the rainfly. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something walking outside. Not the usual rustle of deer hooves, heavier, slower. It paused once right outside my tent. I didn't breathe. My .357 was tucked under my sleeping bag. I listened, hand on the grip. Nothing moved. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then a full minute. I unzipped the tent quietly and poked my head out with a flashlight. Just trees, dead ones, mostly blackened sticks against a darker sky. I did a quick 30-foot sweep around the tent. No prints, nothing broken or disturbed. I told myself it was wind and maybe a raccoon. Still, I moved my tent a little closer to the cabin the next night. Not that a cabin door would stop anyone who really wanted in, but it felt better somehow. The next morning, I went back to where I found the boot. I wanted to look around the creek and see if there was any sign of a body or bones. Might have been someone who tried to bushwhack out of the fire zone and didn't make it. You find things like that sometimes, more often than people think. But there was nothing, just scorched earth, a few down snags, and the same dry boot sitting where I left it. That's when I saw something else. Maybe 20 yards from the boot, in the shadow of a burned-out juniper, there was a strip of fabric hanging from a low branch. Faded red, looked like nylon. I walked over and examined it. It was part of a backpack strap, the kind with padding and mesh. It had been cut clean through. Not frayed, not torn, not melted. A straight slice like a knife or scissors had gone through it. There were no other signs. No pack, no gear, no prints in the ash. Just that single strip swaying gently in the wind. I tagged it and hiked back to the truck. That evening, when I tried to radio it in, I got nothing. Just static. I wasn't too surprised. The signal out there is spotty on the best days. I climbed the nearest rise and tried again. Still nothing. I figured I'd drive out in the morning to a known signal spot and report the findings. I made dinner, dehydrated chili and a half bottle of warm Gatorade, and sat in silence as the sun dropped behind the hills. The wind died completely. No noise at all. That's what I remember most about that night. Total silence. Not even insects. It was like the forest had been vacuumed clean. At some point during the night, I woke up in a full sweat. My tent felt like an oven. I unzipped the flap and sat upright. That's when I saw the cabin door was open. I swear I locked it. I remember clearly turning the old hasp shut, but now it hung wide like something had pushed it inward and didn't bother closing it behind. I stood up barefoot, walked slowly to the door, flashlight in one hand, revolver in the other. I swept the beam across the cabin interior. Empty. No signs of entry. The old rickety cot hadn't shifted. The wood stove door was still latched. Nothing was missing or moved. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. I sat outside until morning, listening for anything. The wind never came back. Next day, I packed everything into the truck and drove 11 miles to the North Ridge, where I knew the radio could usually get out. I contacted dispatch and told them what I'd found, the boot to strap the open cabin. They said they'd send another ranger to relieve me in 2 days so I could head back in for a debrief. I didn't argue. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I slept in the cab of the truck, windows cracked. I didn't sleep well. At 3:13 a.m., I remember the exact time because I looked at my watch. I woke up to a dull thump against the side of the truck. Not a knock, not scratching, just a flat thump, like someone dropped a bag of sand against the rear panel. I sat up fast. My head hit the ceiling. I grabbed the revolver again and looked out the driver's side window. Nothing. I climbed out quietly and checked around with the flashlight. Nothing. No prints. No animals. No wind. Then I walked to the back of the truck and saw the boot. The same one I'd found on the trail. It was sitting upright in the bed of the truck. I stared at it for a full minute, mouth dry, arm tense around the grip of the gun. I don't spook easy. I've had bears charge me. I've dealt with meth head squatters in the hills. I've rappelled down canyons to recover bodies. But that shook me. That cold, familiar boot, sitting neatly in the bed like it had been tucked in by a hand I never saw. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When a relief ranger showed up the next afternoon, I didn't say much. I gave her my report, told her to be careful, and didn't mention the boot. I didn't want her thinking I'd gone soft. I drove straight to the district office, handed in my notes, and asked not to be assigned solo in that burn area again. They didn't argue. A few weeks later, SCR got a report of a missing man from Colorado, solo backpacker, mid-40s. His family said he'd gone off-grid months earlier. They traced his last GPS ping to the west side of the fire zone, near Goose Jaw Creek. They never found his body, but I know where they should have looked, and I never went back. I've worked for the Forest Service for a while now. Most of my time is quiet. Paperwork, trail checks, fire risk monitoring, talking to hikers when they pass through. Sometimes I drive the dirt roads for hours and don't see a single soul. And honestly, I like it that way. I was stationed that summer in a remote part of Northern California. Dense pine forests, steep ridges, and deep canyons carved by creeks that never ran dry. It wasn't a popular area, not like Yosemite or the major parks. That was part of what made it beautiful. But it also meant you had to rely on yourself. If something went wrong, it could take hours before help arrived. Days if weather turned or radios failed. The station I worked out of was a single-room cabin up on Brush Ridge, maybe 12 miles from the nearest paved road. No electricity except a solar panel that powered the radio and some dim lights. No running water. There was a spring nearby where I'd fill up jugs every couple of days. The place had a wood stove, a bunk, a desk, and a wall covered in topo maps. It was simple, but it was enough. In late July, I was assigned a week-long solo patrol covering the upper section of the Ridge Trail. It was a 30-mile loop, poorly marked, barely used, and not maintained as well as it should have been. Part of my job was to document trail conditions, check for signs of erosion, illegal camping, and anything else that needed reporting. I loaded up my gear, tent, food, tools, GPS, radio, and hiked out from the station. The first 2 days went fine. The air was hot and dry, the kind that makes every leaf crunch under your boots. I walked slow, stopped often to jot notes, took photos of blowdowns and eroded switchbacks, marked a few areas where signage had fallen or gone missing, camped one night next to a stream, the next on a flat overlook where you could see the whole canyon open up like a cracked skull. Coyotes howled at night. One bear wandered into view in the early morning, but it didn't notice me. Everything changed on the third day. That morning, I came across something that wasn't right. I was several miles from the nearest access road. No cell signal. No other people around as far as I knew. I was following a section of trail that curved sharply along a cliffside when I noticed boot prints in the dust. Not mine. Too fresh. Still sharp around the edges, meaning they hadn't been stepped on again by animals or flattened by wind. Heavy tread. Big feet. That's not weird by itself. Hikers come through occasionally, but these prints went off trail at a weird angle, cutting directly into the brush. Not toward a lookout or a stream, just straight into thick manzanita and pine. No reason to go that way. I hesitated, then stepped off trail and followed them. The prints continued down a slope, weaving through trees. Someone had definitely come this way. Broken branches, a patch of bark scraped off a tree trunk. After maybe 10 minutes of slow walking, I saw something in the dirt that made me stop cold. A torn glove, black leather, shredded around the palm like it had been caught on something rough and yanked hard. Beside it, drag marks in the soil. 2 long furrows like heels or knees had been pulled. I stared for a long time, listened. The forest was quiet. No birds, no insects. I followed the drag marks. They led downhill, maybe another 40 yards to a flat area tucked between boulders. That's where I found the pack. A large hiking pack, dark green, like something a hunter would carry. Dirty, faded, and torn in several spots. It had been dropped or thrown beside a stump. A pair of trekking poles lay nearby. One snapped in half. I crouched, opened the main pocket. Inside were clothes, some food, and a small plastic map case. The ID card inside said the pack belonged to a man named Daniel Kraus. Mid-40s. California address. I'd never seen his name on the trail logs. Most people check in at trailheads. Signed a registry. It's not required, but it helps if something goes wrong. I hadn't seen Daniel Kraus's name, which meant he either didn't check in or was somewhere he shouldn't be. I radioed in. Static. Nothing. I tried the high-gain antenna, repositioned on a rock. Still nothing. I marked the location on my GPS, took photos, and left a bright orange flagging ribbon nearby. Then I hiked back to the trail and continued north. I planned to climb to higher ground and try the radio again. Maybe from a ridge, I'd get a signal. That evening, I made camp near the edge of a rockslide scar. I set up my tent, cooked dinner, and tried the radio again. This time I got a weak signal. I passed along what I'd found, pack, glove, no sign of the person. Dispatch told me to stay put and wait for morning. A chopper might come out. Maybe SAR would hike in. They said to conserve battery and check in hourly. I didn't sleep much. That night, something moved through my camp. I heard around 1 a.m. footsteps, slow crunching ones. I thought maybe it was a bear, so I sat up with my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to look out. Nothing at first, just trees. Then I saw something flash between them. Not eyes, not an animal, something metallic, a reflection. I turned off my light and waited. Listened. The footsteps circled my camp once, then faded into the trees. Next morning, I found tracks again. Heavy boots. Same tread. They hadn't approached the tent, just circled wide. But there were more now. 2 sets. 2 people had come through in the night. I packed fast and left the site. I didn't care what dispatch said. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for some stranger to come back. I started heading for a known fire road about 12 miles south. It would take me all day, maybe longer, but it was better than sitting still. Around mid-morning, I heard gunfire. 1 shot. Far off. Maybe a mile, maybe more. Could have been a hunter, but it felt wrong. Wrong time of year. Wrong place. Wrong silence afterward. I pushed faster. At noon, I stopped for water at a stream and saw fresh tracks again. Same tread. This time they were following mine. Not parallel. Not intersecting. Following. I kept moving. No brakes. No food. Just water and forward motion. At one point, I ducked into a grove and climbed a boulder to get a better view. The forest rolled out around me. I scanned the trail behind. That's when I saw them. 2 men, far down the slope, moving fast, both in dark clothing. Packs. One carrying something long. Not a trekking pole. I climbed down and ran. Hours passed. I stayed off trail where I could, ducking through the undergrowth, circling around to check my back. My shirt was soaked. Boots blistered my heels. At one point, I scraped my knee and didn't even stop to clean it. By late afternoon, I saw the fire road below. A thin line of dirt carved into the side of the hill. I stumbled down a ravine to reach it. Just as I stepped onto the road, I heard the crack of another shot. Bark exploded from a tree near my head. They'd followed me. They were still here. I didn't wait. I ran. My lungs burned. Legs screamed. I kept going, heart hammering in my ears. I could hear them crashing through brush behind me. Maybe 200 yards back, maybe closer. Eventually, the road widened. I saw the old fire tower ahead. Abandoned. Half collapsed. But it had a ladder. I climbed it. Fast. Hauled myself into the half-rotten lookout box and yanked the trapdoor shut behind me. Then I waited. And I listened. They came down the road not long after. I heard them talking low, their boots on gravel. They stopped near the base of the tower. I held my breath. One of them started climbing. The boards creaked under him. Then crack. The wood broke under his weight and he fell. Cursing. More quiet voices. Then retreating footsteps. They left. I stayed in that tower until dusk, then climbed down and kept walking. All night. No sleep. Just hiking, limping, bleeding from the knee. By sunrise, I reached the ranger station. I radioed in. This time it worked. An hour later, law enforcement officers arrived. I told them everything. Search teams went out that same day. They found the pack, the glove, the broken trekking pole, but not the men. Not Daniel Kraus. Not the two I saw. No blood. No bodies. Just my footprints and theirs. They investigated for weeks. I was interviewed, polygraphed, examined. Nothing came of it. Daniel Kraus was never found. I've since read about other disappearances in that part of the forest. Scattered. Quiet. Off record. They told me it was probably illegal growers or backwoods survivalists. Said I was lucky. They were right. I transferred the next season. Different forest. Different duties. I still go out. Still hike trails. Still sleep under trees. But I never forget that sound. Boots in the night. Not rushing. Just walking. Just close. And I never forget the look of those tracks. How they started behind mine. And never stopped following. I've worked in the Forest Service for over 12 years, mostly in the Northwest. People think being a park ranger is all trees and smiles, giving directions to the waterfall, pointing out elk to tourists, that sort of thing. That's part of it, sure. But the deeper you go into the backcountry, the more you see what the brochures don't print. I'm not talking about ghosts or Bigfoot. I mean the real stuff. People, places, decisions, things that don't sit right. I was assigned to a remote district in northern Washington for 2 years, Gravel Ridge. One of those huge tracts of land nobody really visits unless they're serious about hiking or completely lost. Just scattered trails, some old Forest Service cabins, dense timber, and not a whole lot else. The kind of place where radios don't always work, and it takes you half a day to hike out if you twist your ankle. You get the idea. Every summer, we have a few interns cycle through, fresh out of college, and I'd get paired with one for trail inventory or signage maintenance. That summer, the summer of what happened, I was partnered with a guy named Ross. Quiet kid, mid-20s, former Eagle Scout, wanted to do something meaningful. Nothing remarkable about him. We had 2 weeks of joint assignments, trail checks, some campsite cleanups, bear box inspections. He was competent enough, so I didn't think twice about sending him to check a trail on his own toward the end of his stint. That trail was 47. Trail 47 wasn't special. It was about 8 miles long, snaking through steep pine country, dead-ending at a small overlook with a fire ring. Hardly anyone used it because it was a pain to get to. The only way was by an unmaintained fire road that even our trucks had trouble with unless it was bone dry. Still, we had to check the signage and condition at least once a season, and it was late August, our last window before the weather turned. I gave Ross a paper map and let him take the mule truck up the ridge. Told him to camp overnight, check the fire ring, log any trail erosion, then head back. He left mid-morning. By dusk the next day, he hadn't checked in. I didn't panic right away. You don't in this line of work. Radios fail. People misjudge distance. He had a good head on his shoulders, and I knew he packed right. But by noon the next day, I was hiking out toward 47 with my own pack, GPS, med kit, and enough food for 2. I found the truck at the old Fire Road trailhead. Locked, dust covered, no signs of distress. His boot prints led off down the trail in the right direction. I followed them. Now I know this trail, walked it 6 times before. It's narrow, overgrown in sections, and steep. The forest is thick and dark, even during the day. You don't get much undergrowth because the trees crowd everything out. Feels claustrophobic at times. All you hear is the wind moving through the branches and sometimes the creak of old trunks. It's peaceful until you start noticing how alone you really are. A few miles in, I found something odd. Ross's boot prints veered off the trail near a bend, heading slightly uphill into a patch of old-growth pine. I figured he needed to take a leak or check something out. I almost kept going until I noticed a small scrap of red fabric snagged on a branch about head height. Ross's pack had a red shoulder strap. I marked the spot with a trail flag and moved in. The boot prints didn't return to the trail. They kept going. The terrain got rougher, full of loose stone and fallen logs. No reason for him to go that way. And the deeper I followed those prints, the less they made sense. They weren't meandering. He wasn't lost or confused. They moved with purpose. I followed them for another 45 minutes, and that's when I found the first thing that made my stomach drop. His tent. It was pitched in a small clearing, but not the usual fire ring area. This was maybe half a mile off the actual trail, surrounded by thick pine. The rainfly was half off, and one of the guy lines had been cut, not snapped, cut clean. His sleeping bag was inside, unzipped, with his foam mat crumpled like someone left in a hurry. No food out, no cookware, just a tent and a half-empty water bladder. No signs of struggle, no blood, no prints leading away. Just nothing. I circled a good 50 yards out in every direction. Found broken branches here and there, but no clear direction. Called out, waited, listened. Nothing. I marked the site on my GPS, packed up what I could carry from his gear, and hiked back out in the dark. The next morning, I logged it as a missing person report and called in SAR, search and rescue. Over the next 3 days, we had dogs, drones, and 9 people combing the area around 47. We found no body, no gear, no clothing, no signs of Ross. After a week, they called off the search. The official line was that Ross likely fell, got disoriented, and succumbed to exposure. Happens more often than people think. But I knew that trail. I knew how Ross hiked. And there was something about those clean boot prints veering off trail like he was going to meet someone. Something about the cut guy line. Something about how his gear was half there, half gone, like he planned to stay another night, but never got the chance. After the search ended, I asked to keep working that district. Said I wanted to stay familiar with the terrain. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't let it go. I went back to 47 3 times that fall, even once after the snow started. Nothing. Spring came, and I hiked it again. Everything looked normal. New signage, good trail condition, no campers. Then one morning in early June, I got a call from dispatch about an illegal fire up on the ridge. They'd picked up smoke on the satellite near the end of Trail 47. I volunteered to check it out. The hike up was uneventful. Everything was just how I remembered it. But when I got near the overlook, I smelled it with smoke. Fresh. Someone had been there recently. And then I saw the fire ring. Not ashes. Fresh coals. Still warm. Next to it was a pile of pine branches and what looked like a rough windbreak built with bark slabs and dirt. No tent. No pack. No sign of anyone. Just a fire and a sock. Faded. Red and gray. The same color Ross wore with his uniform boots. It was placed neatly on a rock, like someone set it there on purpose. I called it in, gave the coordinates, and waited. No one ever came back for the fire pit. I returned a week later. Everything was gone. No windbreak. No sock. Just scorched dirt and a ring of stones. For the rest of the season, I patrolled 47 every few weeks. No campers. No signs. But sometimes I find weird little things off trail. A torn page from a field notebook. A single glove. A trail mix wrapper tucked under a root. Always old. Always weather-worn, but somehow /placed. By the end of the summer, I was burned out. Couldn't sleep. Started second-guessing my memory, my judgment. So I asked for a transfer. Got assigned to a more trafficked park down south. Lots of visitors. Campgrounds. Civilization. Still, every now and then, I think about Ross and that stretch of trail. I've looked at the satellite maps. There's nothing up there. No old cabins, no shacks, no ranger stations. Just trees and silence. I've worked long enough to know when something doesn't want to be found. And I think Ross found something on Trail 47. Something human. Maybe a drifter. Maybe a recluse. Someone who doesn't want company. Someone who's good at staying hidden. And when you find someone like that, you don't get to leave. I've been a ranger in the Northern Rockies for nearly a decade now. That much time alone in remote country changes a person. Not always in bad ways, but you grow into a kind of stillness that city people can't really understand. Out there, every sound matters. Every track in the dirt. Every tree that suddenly looks bent a different way. There was one stretch back in 2018 when I was stationed in a remote fire recovery area near the Bitterroot Range. About 20,000 acres had burned the year before in a lightning-caused wildfire. We called it the Deer Ridge Burnt Scar. The fire ran fast and hot. No structure damage, but the forest floor was gutted. My job that summer was solo patrols through the scar and surrounding ridge lines, mostly to track regrowth, monitor erosion, and keep an eye out for illegal campers, poachers, or ATV riders going into sensitive recovery zones. I was the only one out there most days. The rest of the district staff was short that season. Budget cuts. It was a lonely patrol post. One of those where the trailhead is 2 hours of dirt road away from the nearest paved highway, and even a trip to town takes half a day. I didn't mind it. Not at first. I liked working alone. I was staying in a primitive cabin about 3 miles from the edge of the burn scar. No power except solar. Gravity-fed water tank from spring uphill with stove for heat. It had a simple radio I used to check in with the district office every evening around 1900 hours. Other than that, I had no phone signal and didn't see another person for weeks at a time. That summer, something fell off. Not in a ghost story way. Nothing magical or haunted. Just off. The scar itself was unnatural. Of course, all burn scars look that way. But this one was especially eerie. It wasn't just the blackened trees. It was the silence. Usually, even in burn areas, birds start to come back. Small mammals. Insects buzzing around the new grass. But this place stayed quiet. Too quiet. Almost like the fire took the noise with it. I started noticing things. My first sign that something wasn't right came about 3 weeks into patrols. I was deep in the eastern section of the scar, where the slopes run steep into a series of gorges. I was following a game trail just to note new vegetation growth. I noticed a pile of stones off the trail. Not cairns, just a small stack, maybe knee-high. The kind you sometimes see where hikers leave markers, but this wasn't a hiking route. It was a hard scramble just to get in there, and the area had been closed since the fire. I chalked it up to maybe another ranger or biologist passing through months earlier and didn't think much of it. But then, a few days later, I found another. This one was bigger, more deliberate. It had a large flat stone on top, almost like a lid. And this one had a blackened jawbone resting on the rock, cleaned of any flesh. It was animal, maybe a coyote or fox, judging by the size and teeth, but I couldn't say for sure. I radioed it in. No reply. That happened sometimes. Weather interfered with signal, or the base station had already closed for the night. I noted the coordinates, took a few photos, and marked the spot with flagging tape. The next morning, I hiked back in to check again. The stack was gone. I looked around to see if maybe wind had knocked it down or an animal had disturbed it, but there were no signs of disturbance. No scattered rocks. No tape. Just dirt, flat and smooth, like nothing had been there. I didn't report that. I told myself maybe I had misremembered the spot. That seemed easier than trying to explain it to someone at the office. After that, I started sleeping worse. The nights got longer, heavier. I wake up around 2 or 3 a.m. most nights with that strange feeling, like someone was watching from just beyond the tree line. The cabin had a small porch light rigged to the solar battery, and I started leaving it on all night, even though it drained the charge. I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was moving around out there. Then there were the prints. I was hiking along a fire road one afternoon when I found them. Human boot tracks. Big ones. But the spacing was wrong. Too close together, like someone was limping or dragging a leg. They weren't fresh, maybe a day old, but the pattern ran for over a quarter mile along the edge of a washed-out slope before vanishing into the underbrush. No campsites nearby. No permits issued. The access road had been locked, and only the Forest Service had the keys. I checked the lock myself that evening. No damage. No sign of tampering. Still sealed. I started logging my movements more carefully after that. Times, directions, GPS waypoints. I wanted something on paper in case anything went bad. A week later, I found the old trail. I was bushwhacking up a ridge just north of the main burn scar, checking for erosion after a storm. The soil was loose, and a small rock slide had knocked a few pines over. As I followed the slide path up, I noticed a narrow groove cutting across the slope, almost like a man-made path, grown over by decades of moss and pine needles. It wasn't on my maps. Even the historical topo sheets didn't show it. But it was too consistent to be natural. It wrapped around the slope with careful, steady grade, like a logging road, or maybe a fire break from years ago. I followed it for about half a mile before I saw the structure. It was buried in trees, just the remains of an old shack. Maybe 10 by 10 feet, rotted timbers half collapsed, roof caved in. Looked like it hadn't seen use in 50 years or more. A hunter's cabin, maybe, or a fire lookout's old tool shed. But what bothered me was what I found inside. There were bones, not just scattered animal bones. Neatly arranged rows of femurs, vertebrae, small skulls lined up on a shelf nailed to one of the few standing walls. Some looked fresh. Others had clearly been there for years. There were also rusted tools, hooks, snare wire, a saw blade, a cleaver with a handle that looked burnt. I didn't touch anything. I took photos and GPS coordinates, then backed out. I hiked straight back to the cabin and filed a full report. This time, I stayed up late to make sure the signal went through. I didn't get a reply until the next morning. The office told me they'd send someone up from the district station to check it out, but it might take a few days due to other priorities. I didn't go back to the shack. That night, I locked the cabin door, something I hadn't done all summer, and I kept the porch light on again. Around 3:15 a.m., I woke up. There was a noise outside, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the gravel path near the water tank. I lay in my bunk, holding my breath. My sidearm was locked in a case by the door. I didn't have time to get it without making noise. The dragging stopped. I stayed still for what felt like an hour. Then, quietly, I got up and peeked out through the slit in the curtain. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. The gravel path looked undisturbed. The next morning, I found a trail of drag marks, fresh grooves in the dirt that led from the edge of the tree line to the water tank, then looped behind the outhouse and disappeared into the woods. I started packing. I wasn't scheduled to rotate out for another 10 days, but I radioed in and requested immediate reassignment. I cited possible unauthorized backcountry activity, potential safety risk. The supervisor told me to sit tight and that they'd dispatch someone within 72 hours. I agreed, but I kept packing. That afternoon, I noticed movement near the tree-line again. This time I saw it. A man. He was standing still, just beyond the brush line, maybe 50 yards out, wearing dark clothes, pants, and a jacket. No pack, no gear, just standing there, facing the cabin. I shouted. No response. I raised the radio and called it in, watching him the whole time. By the time I looked back up, he was gone. They sent 2 LE Rangers the next day by helicopter. I briefed them, showed the photos, the shack location, the prints, the drag marks. They swept the area for nearly 12 hours. Found the old structure, confirmed the bones. Most were animal, but at least 2 were identified later as human. They found no man, no fresh tracks, no signs of another person in the area. I was rotated out that night. Later, I heard through a friend that the district quietly classified the area as a cultural heritage site under review and sealed off the trail access entirely. The shack was supposedly dismantled and the bones collected. Nothing was ever officially released to the public. No report, no press. Just buried in paperwork. I never went back. The part that gets me, the part one can't forget, wasn't the man in the woods or the bones or the dragging sounds at night. It's what I saw when I unpacked my gear weeks later, back at home. Tucked into the bottom of my field bag, beneath my extra socks and topo maps, was a stone. Flat, char black, and resting on it was a single animal jawbone, cleaned white, with 2 small holes drilled through the back. I never packed that. I know I didn't. I quit the Forest Service 6 months later. I took a job as a maintenance tech at a small county park near the city. Paved trails, streetlights, people. I still don't sleep well. Some nights I wake up just before 3 and I swear I hear it. The soft scrape of something dragging across gravel. But I don't check any. I took the assignment because I needed the money. I've been bouncing between seasonal ranger jobs for years, never staying long in one place. Mostly backcountry patrols, trail maintenance, the occasional wildfire support. I liked the isolation, preferred the silence of the woods to the noise of people. When the regional office called offering me a summer position manning a fire lookout in the Bitterroots, I said yes before I even heard the full details. It was remote, about as remote as you can get without crossing into Canada. No road access. I was flown in by helicopter with a month's worth of supplies, a solar radio for check-ins, and a rifle for emergencies. The lookout was perched at around 7,500 feet, overlooking a huge swath of forest and mountain ridges. The nearest ranger station was about 30 miles south by trail. I was alone. I'd done lookout work before, but never for more than a few days at a time. This assignment was supposed to be 6 weeks. Just me, the tower, and the trees. That was fine by me. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. I spent my time logging cloud patterns, monitoring smoke reports, and reading paperbacks left behind by the previous ranger. The tower itself was old but sturdy. Wooden frame, metal roof, single-room cabin with windows on all sides. A small propane stove, a cot, a field desk. Basic but functional. I kept a journal. It helped keep my thoughts organized, kept the days from blending together. On the 16th day, I noticed movement in the valley to the north. I've been scanning the ridgelines with my binoculars after sunrise. There was a cluster of pines below what the topographic map labeled as Dead Horse Basin. Right at the edge of a meadow, I saw what looked like someone moving through the trees. No pack, no bright clothing, just a dark figure, slow moving. It's not uncommon for hikers to go off trail, especially hunters or backcountry campers. But this area wasn't exactly popular. No trails, no easy access. I logged the sighting and kept an eye out. The figure disappeared into the tree line within minutes. That night I felt off. Hard to describe. The air felt thicker somehow. Still and too quiet. Usually, even at that altitude, the wind would rattle the tower's beams or whistle through the trees. But that night was still. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. I spotted movement again. Same location. A little closer. The figure appeared in the meadow around mid-morning and stood motionless for what felt like 10 full minutes. Then it moved again, slowly weaving through the trees, not toward any clear destination. Almost like it was searching for something. I logged it, but there wasn't much I could do. The radio only reached the regional office during specific windows, and it wasn't exactly an emergency. Just a strange sighting. Maybe a local trapper. Still, I didn't like it. There were boot prints below the tower. Fresh ones. I found them early in the morning when I went down to check the propane tank. The soil there was soft, high-altitude tundra with patches of snowmelt. I could see at least 2 distinct tracks, both human, medium-sized, spaced like someone walking normally. They came from the tree line, circled the tower, and disappeared back into the woods. I had not heard anything during the night. That shook me more than I'd like to admit. There was no reason for anyone to be up here. And if someone had come, why wouldn't they knock or call out? Why just walk around the tower and leave? I loaded the rifle and kept it close. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed inside the tower the entire day. I didn't go down to the clearing. I watched the trees and listened for any sound, footsteps, voices, anything. The binoculars never left my hands. I scanned constantly, even when my arms were shaking from the tension. Nothing. But at sunset, I found something strange. On the south-facing side of the tower, just below the wooden decking, someone had scratched a mark into the foundation beam. A deep X, carved at an angle, as if with a knife. I would have noticed it earlier if it had been there. It was fresh. The wood was still pale where it had been cut. I radioed the station that night, reported the tracks and the marking. They acknowledged, said to keep an eye out, and let them know if anything escalated. They didn't sound too concerned. I heard movement just after midnight. Heavy footsteps on the gravel path below the tower. Then a sound like someone exhaling sharply, almost a grunt. I sat up in my cot, grabbed the rifle, heart pounding. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't move. Just listened. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded. In the morning, I found more tracks, larger this time, deeper in the soil. Whoever it was had stood at the base of the ladder for several minutes. Just standing there, watching. I found another X carved into the wooden support post. This time lower down, almost at eye level if you were standing on the ground. I started keeping watch at night. No more sleeping. No sightings. No new tracks. But the feeling didn't go away. I stopped going outside. My skin crawled every time I looked at the woods. I started hearing noises that weren't there. Branches snapping, faint breathing. Always just outside the tower. I told myself it was paranoia, that isolation messes with your head. That much time alone, your brain starts inventing things to fill the silence. But then I noticed the camera was missing. I had an old trail camera I kept mounted on the west railing to capture storms and wildlife. I went to check the SD card, and the whole unit was gone. Mounting bracket too, torn clean off. I found the screws on the ground, bent and stripped, like someone had yanked it off violently. I didn't sleep at all that night. I set up a tripwire alarm using some fishing line and a couple empty cans. It was crude, but functional. I ran the line across the bottom of the ladder, just under the decking. If anyone came up during the night, I'd hear it. At 3:12 a.m., the cans clattered to the floor. I jumped out of bed, rifle in hand, and scanned the trapdoor. Nothing. No movement. No one trying to come up. But the line had been cut. Cleanly. As if with a knife. Not broken. Cut. I stayed at the ready until sunrise. I asked for extraction. Radioed it in during the morning check-in. I told them someone was stalking the tower. Possibly multiple people. I cited safety concerns and said I wasn't comfortable staying without backup. They said the heli was grounded for maintenance. Wouldn't be able to pick me up until day 30. 5 more days. I told them I understood. I didn't. Not really. The solar panel was smashed. I found in the morning glass shattered, wiring pulled out. I hadn't heard anything overnight, but without that panel, my radio wouldn't work. I had maybe half a charge left in the battery unit. Enough for 1 call, maybe 2. I tried the emergency channel. No response. Just static. The antenna looked intact, but I couldn't be sure. Even if the heli was ready, I had no way to call them. I rationed my food, set more traps around the perimeter using cans, pots, anything metal I could find. Anything to give me noise. I saw them in daylight. 3 figures, moving just inside the tree line, one on each side of the clearing. Coordinated. Watching. I didn't signal. I didn't raise my binoculars. I just sat inside and watched them back. They didn't approach. Just waited, like they were trying to wear me down. That night, I found the fuel line to the stove had been cut. Not chewed cut. Clean and deliberate. I had no fire. No heat. Night temperatures dropped below freezing at that elevation. I started preparing for escape. Packed a go bag with what I could carry, water, food, ammo. I mapped a route to the nearest fire road. It would be a 30-mile hike, mostly downhill but through rough terrain. And if they followed me, I didn't think I'd make it. Still, I couldn't stay. I planned to leave on day 29, just before dawn. I didn't leave. I woke up to find the trapdoor open. Just open, hanging by its hinges. Nothing below. But the ladder was slick, coated in something dark and sticky. Blood. There was no body. No sign of anyone hurt. Just blood, smeared along the rungs and pooled at the base. A lot of it. I didn't go down. I couldn't. I waited all day with the rifle aimed at the door. That night, I saw firelight in the woods. 3 small campfires in a triangle around the tower. Distant but clear. They didn't move. They just burned all night long. At first light, the helicopter came. I heard it before I saw it, chop of the blades, echoing off the peaks. I burst out of the tower, waving both arms like a madman. They landed 30 yards downslope. I didn't wait. I sprinted. The pilot asked if I was okay. I said yes. I didn't look back at the tower. I filed a report with the Forest Service. They launched an investigation, sent in ground crews and law enforcement. But they found nothing. No footprints. No marks. No blood. Just an empty tower. They said maybe I imagined it. That isolation can mess with you. I didn't argue. But know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I wasn't alone up there. The worst part? That wasn't the first X. When I got home, I found one carved into the wooden frame of my front door. Small. Neat. Fresh. I was stationed in a district no one really wanted. Most of the big-name parks get the funding, the fame, the visitors. But some of us draw a different kind of card. Places off the highway, half-forgotten forest regions that only see foot traffic from hunters, maybe some locals doing sketchy stuff, or lost hikers. That was where I worked, in a slice of high country on the far edge of a national forest in the Rockies. The land was jagged, harsh, mostly sharp slopes, and long drainages filled with scree and blown-down trees. It was dangerous if you weren't careful. The trails were thin lines cut into steep terrain, often washed out or blocked by rockfall, and the signage was poor to non-existent. My station was called Pine Table Lookout, named for the wide, flat rock plateau that jutted out over the valley below. There was a fire lookout tower there once, but it got torn down before I ever arrived. What remained was a small ranger cabin, a tool shed, and a locked box for SAR gear, rope, stretchers, trauma packs, and radio batteries. I was assigned there late in the season. Fall was biting down hard already. The nights got cold quick, and once the snow started to stick, the roads would become impassable. The only access in and out was a long, rutted dirt road barely maintained by the district. I had a lifted park truck with chains and a winch, but I didn't trust it. Once you were in, you were in. I got there in early October with the goal of surveying a trail section that had seen recent damage. A hiker emailed the district office with photos of a rock slide that had come down across Switchback Trail, a steep segment that drops fast into a canyon called Black Hollow. He said it looked unstable. My boss forwarded me the complaint, attached a trail survey form, and told me to stay put at the cabin after checking it out. The trip to the trailhead was about 4 miles from the cabin. I loaded up my pack with flagging tape, a GPS, clipboard, basic medical gear, and a portable radio that works sometimes if I climb the rocks near the ridgeline. I also carried a sidearm. The higher-ups pretend like that's not needed, but anyone who's worked these forests long enough knows otherwise. You don't carry it for animals. I hiked out early, making good time. The air was cold but dry, the light clean and sharp. Pines thinned out the higher I climbed, until it was just low brush and bare shale. When I reached the start of Switchback Trail, I saw the damage right away. A wide section of the slope had come down hard. Boulders the size of stoves and refrigerators were scattered across the trail, some balanced in ways that made my stomach tighten. You could feel in your body when the land wasn't done moving yet, like being on a floor that might suddenly tilt. I flagged the start of the slide and walked the edge carefully, keeping my weight low and my steps sure. I took photos, marked coordinates, noted the size and type of debris. Some of the boulders still had clean breaks on them, sharp edges and unweathered faces, like they dropped just yesterday. One of them was big enough to crush a car flat, the kind of thing you don't want above a trail. As I moved along the slide's path, I saw something that made me stop. There was a line of boot prints going right through the slide zone, and they weren't mine. They came from the uphill side, crossed a mess of rocks and mud, and continued down toward the canyon. I bent down and studied them. They were fresh, pressed deep into damp earth. A single person, medium size, normal hiking boots, nothing fancy. I followed the prints with my eyes down the slope and saw more of them. The person had kept going. That didn't make sense. No one was supposed to be out there this late in the season. The trail was marked as unsafe on the district site, and even if someone missed that, the slide made it clearly dangerous. I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. I stayed still for a long time, just listening. The mountain was quiet. Wind, birds, and nothing else. Eventually, I made the choice to follow the prints. Not far, just enough to make sure someone wasn't stuck down there. I keyed the radio and gave my location. No reply. Not surprising. The canyon walls cut off most signal. As I dropped down into the switchbacks, I noticed the prints started getting more erratic. The spacing was uneven. Some were angled sharply, like the person had slipped or changed direction. I saw skid marks too, short slides in the dirt where boots had lost grip. Whatever happened, it didn't look good. I rounded a bend and found a hiking pole snapped in half, just lying there next to a tree. About 15 feet down, a sharp turn curved out of sight, and the drop-off on the other side was steep, almost vertical. I moved slow now. Every part of me was alert. When I reached the turn, I saw the rest of it. A torn section of shirt, blood dark, not fresh, on a rock ledge about 10 feet below the trail. And at the bottom, tangled in dead brush and loose talus, was a shape. It was a body, crumpled and still. I climbed down with care, not trusting the rock under my feet. When I reached the bottom, I knelt beside the man. He was maybe mid-30s, beard, brown coat, trail pack beside him. Face smashed, limbs twisted wrong. Did a day, maybe 2. No ID in his pockets. No wallet. I checked for a phone, and when I found it, the screen was smashed, but I stuck it in my pack. Might be useful later. I took photos of everything, documented his position, location, Cause of death, likely blunt trauma from the fall. I felt cold. The kind of cold that isn't from the air. I didn't know him, but I felt a connection somehow, like seeing a warning written in your own handwriting. I hiked back up slow, checked my radio again. Still dead. I flagged the area, marked it on my map, and started back toward the cabin. The wind was stronger now, pushing in from the west, whistling across the rock faces like a breath through teeth. About halfway back, I noticed something strange. A second set of tracks. Smaller prints. Maybe a woman or a kid. They crossed the first man's path, then doubled back. I followed them a short way. They led into the woods, then vanished. Not washed out, not faded, just gone. I didn't chase it. Light was fading, and I didn't want to be on the slope after dark. Back at the cabin, I logged everything, noted the need for recovery personnel, and tried again to radio the district. Still nothing. I powered down, made a fire in the stove, and sat there thinking. Who was he? Why was he up there alone? And who made the second set of prints? Sleep didn't come easy that night. The wind rattled the windows hard. I heard something thump against the shed, but I didn't check. Too dark. I just waited for morning. Next day, I tried again to call in. Still no signal. I climbed to the highest ridge, where I sometimes got a few bars of reception. Nothing. I kept trying for 2 more hours. Static. Then I found a line. A section of the radio cable had been slashed. Not torn, not weathered. Cut clean. Knife or shears. Someone didn't want me calling out. I felt my stomach drop. I checked the cabin. No sign of break-in, but my logbook was gone. Completely gone. No way the wind took that. It was a thick, bound field book. I hiked back to the rockfall, heart beating fast the whole way. The body was gone. No drag marks. No signs of an animal. Just gone. I looked around, then saw it. Something tucked into the crook a nearby tree. My logbook. Pages torn out. A message scrawled in pen on the inside of the cover. Leave. That was it. No signature. No clue who left it. I left the site, returned to the cabin, packed my gear. I waited one more night, just in case help arrived. It didn't. No one came. The next morning, I drove the truck down the rutted road, chains rattling on the tires, eyes jumping to every shadow. It took me hours to reach the nearest outpost with a landline. I called the district supervisor. He didn't believe me at first. Thought I hit my head or made it up. But eventually, a search and recovery team was sent in. They found nothing. No body, no blood, no prints, just a snapped hiking pole, and my shredded logbook. An investigation followed. Quietly, internally. They told me to take a week off. I handed in my badge that same day. That job changes you, not the way people think. It's not the wildlife or the long hours or the isolation. It's the human part. The things other people do when no one is watching. What they'll do when they think they can't be caught. The places they hide. No one ever found out who the man was. No missing persons report matched his description. The phone was blank, wiped clean. Whoever followed him, whoever left that message, either they knew the land better than I did, or they were ready to disappear for good. I never went back. Some nights I still see those prints in my head. Clean, crisp, then gone. And I still think about that word, leave. Not yelled, not panicked, just simple, final. Like someone letting you off the hook one last time before they don't anymore. Whatever was going on in that canyon, I listened. I left. I was about 6 months into my new assignment at West Pines National Forest. It wasn't the biggest forest in the system, but it was dense, rugged, and far from anything resembling civilization. That suited me just fine. I didn't become a ranger for socializing or working in some visitor center handing out pamphlets. I like being out there, boots in the dirt, eyes on the trees, alone with the wind and whatever else wandered through the underbrush. West Pines covered about 130,000 acres of pine, fir, and some nasty steep ridges. My district was the northern half, maybe 60,000 acres, give or take. The terrain was rough, switchbacks, jagged rocks, ravines that snuck up on you if you weren't paying attention. The forest wasn't tourist-friendly. It was too remote, and the trails weren't paved, just well-worn paths that would disappear if you stepped too far off. The kind of place only serious backcountry hikers came to. We had maybe 2 or 3 trailheads that saw any traffic, and even then it was sparse. I was one of only 2 backcountry rangers working that northern section, and the other guy, Eddie, had gone on medical leave 3 weeks earlier after breaking his leg in a rockfall. That left me covering the whole thing alone. I wasn't worried. I'd done it before. But looking back now, I think something in me already knew this stretch was going to go bad. Nothing specific. I wasn't having dreams or getting gut feelings, but something about the silence in those first few days stuck out to me. Normally you hear things. Squirrels, birds, bugs, branches shifting. The forest has a sound to it, even when it's calm. But the northern reaches had gone quiet. Dead quiet. And that silence stretched out for days. Still, I did my job. I logged trail conditions, checked the old fire towers for storm damage, clear debris. I'd camp out for 4 or 5 nights at a time, then hike back to the cabin we used as a base station. It was small, solar panels, propane stove, old radio, but it was enough. It was on my 3rd week solo that I came across the first sign something was wrong. I've been hiking north of Trail 14, an unofficial path most maps didn't even list anymore. It used to lead to an old Ranger fire lookout up on a cliff edge, but that lookout had been decommissioned a decade ago. The structure was still there, barely, and sometimes I'd go up there just to get a view of the tree line. About 4 miles up that trail, I noticed a small stone pile just off to the side. Cairns aren't unusual out here. Hikers build them to mark where trails turn. But this one was wrong. It was too short, too wide, and it was placed right in the middle of a slight dip in the trail where no one would build one. I walked over, and what I noticed first was the smell. Rot. I dug through the pile, carefully. Something small was under the rocks. Turned out to be a skinned rabbit. Not eaten, not torn up by a predator. Just skinned and folded, almost neatly like someone had prepared it but then buried it under rocks. It was fresh, too, maybe a day old. Blood had seeped into the soil, but there weren't any maggots or flies yet. I didn't touch it. I took photos, marked the GPS, and moved on, thinking maybe a trapper had done it and buried it out of guilt or something. People do weird things in the woods. I've learned not to dwell on every strange sight I come across. But that wasn't the only one. 2 days later, south of the old logging road, I found another one. Same kind of stone pile. This time a skinned fox. Again, nothing eaten. Just dead and buried. It was laid out belly up, paws tucked to its chest. Clean cuts, no claw marks, no signs of struggle. I looked around, but the area was untouched. No boot prints, no trash, no broken branches. That night, I stayed in one of the emergency lean-tos we'd built during a wildfire scare last year. I set up a small perimeter, just basic stuff. I tied thread to nearby trees, a little trick to see if anything large passed through in the dark. I slept light. Woke up once around 2 a.m. to a rustling sound, but it was nothing. When I checked the thread in the morning, none had broken. I told myself maybe it was just some local trapper I hadn't heard of. Maybe someone squatting off-grid, which isn't uncommon. But even then, why kill animals like that and leave them skinned in ritualistic little graves? On my hike back to the base cabin that afternoon, I found something that froze me solid. Just a mile out from the cabin, someone had carved a small symbol into a tree trunk. 2 vertical lines with a horizontal one running through the middle. Looked like a double cross, almost like a railway sign. I thought maybe it was an old blaze mark at first, but it was too deep, too clean, and fresh. I didn't have my carving knife out there. I hadn't passed anyone in 5 days. The cuts were barely weathered. I circled the tree, looking for more, and I found them. 9 more trees, all within a quarter-mile radius, all marked with that same carved shape. All fresh, some deeper than others, all at the same height, about chest level. I didn't touch any of them. I just stood there, staring at the trees, trying to understand what this meant. Who was carving symbols this deep in the woods without leaving tracks or signs of campfires or trash? I picked up my pace and made it back to the cabin just before dark. That night was the first time I really felt unsafe. I double-checked the door and windows. They were locked. I turned the radio on low, listening to static. No contact, just dead air. I had no cell service this deep, and the satellite phone only worked when it wanted to. I kept the cabin lights off and just sat there listening. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Slow, deliberate steps on the gravel. Not animal movement, heavier. The kind of weight you only hear from boots. I stayed absolutely still. My bed is tucked in the corner with a small window just above it. I didn't move, didn't look out. I just listened. The steps stopped. Then I heard a quiet knock. 3 knocks. Slow, spaced out. Then silence. I laid there, barely breathing for hours. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I opened the door carefully. No footprints. No marks. But out about 30 feet from the cabin, just at the tree line, was another stone pile. Same shape. This time, there was no animal. Just a clean, white rag folded on top. I radioed in the incident, told the dispatch I was requesting support to do a sweep. The connection was rough, but I got through. They told me someone could be out in 2 days. Budget cuts, low staffing, all that usual crap. I couldn't wait 2 days. Not after that night. I packed my rifle and went out toward the trail where I found the last animal pile. I figured if someone was doing this, they were staying close by. I tracked the ridge line, stuck to higher elevation where I could get a better look down through the woods. That's when I found it. A small camp. It was almost invisible from above. Someone had used moss and branches to blend it in. They'd cut a shallow pit and set up a tarp over it. I approached slowly, rifle raised, ears open. Nobody was there. Inside the pit were bones. Dozens of them. Small ones, rabbits, birds, foxes, all stripped clean. And in the dirt wall of the pit, someone had scratched the same symbol. Over and over. Dozens of times. I backed away, retraced my path, and hiked back to the cabin. Didn't sleep again. That next night, I heard more steps. But this time they circled the cabin. Slow. Deliberate. I couldn't see anything through the window, but I stayed low, rifle in hand, waiting. Then the steps stopped, and I heard the sound of gravel shifting like something being dragged. In the morning, I found another pile, right outside the door. This one had a pair of cleanly folded socks on top. No note, no animal, just socks. I knew then that whoever was out there wasn't just watching. They were playing a game, getting closer, testing my patience or my fear, or maybe just seeing how long it would take before I cracked. When the other rangers finally arrived 2 days later, we swept the woods in a 6-mile radius. Found nothing. The pit had been emptied. No tarp, no bones, no markings. The trees with the carved symbols had been stripped, bark peeled away, completely removed like someone didn't want any trace left. Even the piles of stones had been knocked over. We found no tracks, no trash, nothing. I filed a report. It got logged as unauthorized squatter activity, and they assigned 2 more rangers to patrol rotation for the next month. Nothing else ever happened. But here's what sticks with me, even now. A week after that last night, I went to open the cabin closet to pull out a first aid kit for a cut I'd gotten while clearing brush. When I opened it, there was something folded neatly on the top shelf. A clean, white rag. Same kind as the one on the last pile. I never told anyone about that part. Not in the report. Not to the other rangers. That was my last season at West Pines. I transferred out 3 months later. Officially, it was to be closer to family. But the truth is simpler than that. The forest isn't haunted. There are no ghosts or monsters in the trees. But people are worse. And the quiet ones? They never really leave. I've worked as a backcountry ranger in northern Montana for almost 12 years now. I've hiked more miles than I could count, patched up everything from broken boots to deep lacerations, and had my share of close calls with grizzlies, river crossings, and even a rock slide once. But there's one assignment that stayed with me. Not in the heroic way you tell over a campfire. It stayed in the back of my mind like a splinter. Quiet most days, but always there. It happened back in late September 4 years ago. We were closing down most of the backcountry cabins and seasonal stations for the winter. There was an early freeze expected that year, and the trail conditions had already started to deteriorate. Some light snow in the high passes and ice forming around shaded creeks. One of the stations, Split Pine Cabin, was still unchecked. Normally 2 rangers go out together, but we were short-staffed and I'd been there dozens of times. It's about 26 miles from the nearest roadhead, tucked behind a ridge, with no trails directly in or out anymore. The old ones washed out years back, and no one ever bothered to restore them because hardly anyone used that station. It's the kind of place they send only the experienced folks to because of the remoteness. I packed light. A few days worth of food, the usual med kit, stove, sleeping bag, satellite beacon, and of course the required logs and lockout forms. My job was simple. Hike in, inventory the supplies, log the closure, lock it up, and hike out. I planned for 4 days, 2 in, 2 out, with the middle day for the work. I started from Ridgeline Station early in the morning. The first stretch was familiar, well-marked trail, cool air, and that crisp smell of pine and dry dirt. I kept a good pace. Made camp by dusk at the edge of lost Elk Hollow. It's a known camping area with a bear hang already set up. That night was uneventful. Stars were sharp and cold overhead. Wind low, no animal activity nearby. Second day, I left early and started bushwhacking around mile 19. The last few miles to Split Pine are slow. The terrain turns nasty. Lots of deadfall, uneven ground, steep drops, and heavy brush. My GPS had the cabin marked, but I knew better than to trust a straight line on a screen. Even experienced hikers get turned around out here. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the cabin. Split Pine is small. 1 room with stove, bunk, table, bear box out back, and a shed to the side. It sits in a clearing with the forest pressing in on all sides and a small spring running behind it. I remember noting that the air felt heavy, even though the sky was still clear. There wasn't the usual breeze that passed through in late afternoon. It was quiet, not peaceful, just quiet in that way that makes you stop and listen for something you can't quite hear. I did a full sweep. Checked the windows, door, stovepipe, all fine. No signs of animals or intruders. Inside, everything was just as expected. Dusty, cold, but nothing out of place. I signed it on the log, set up my gear, and unpacked a freeze-dried meal for dinner. After eating, I did what I always do. I took notes. Weather, cabin condition, trail observations. The sun started dipping behind the ridge, and the shadows stretched across the clearing. I didn't light the stove, too early in the season for that much cold, but I unrolled my bag and settled in as the dark came in fast. That first night, something woke me up. It was probably around 2 or 3 a.m. The inside of the cabin was dark, but my eyes adjusted. I didn't hear anything at first, but I had that prickly feeling, the kind that raises the hairs on your arms before your brain catches up. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud, just a soft, slow dragging sound, like something moving through the leaves outside the cabin. It didn't sound like a deer or a bear. It was too controlled, too slow, almost deliberate. I stayed still, reached over, and quietly took hold of my bear spray and headlamp. I waited for a few more minutes. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The faint crunch of leaves, the snap of a stick. I turned on the light. The inside lit up, nothing but wooden walls and my scattered gear. I killed the beam, slipped on my boots, and crept to the window. I didn't open it, just got close and listened. Silence again. Eventually, I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. Not really. Next morning, I checked the perimeter. No tracks. No sign of animals near the shed. Bear box untouched. Nothing disturbed. I chalked it up to wind, maybe a branch falling. That's the thing about the forest. Sound travels strange at night. I got to work. Took inventory. Everything was there. Cleaned out the stove. Made sure the fire extinguisher hadn't expired. Cleared debris from the roof and gutters. Routine work. I took a break around noon and sat out behind the cabin by the spring. Still no breeze. The forest felt off. No birds. No squirrels. That doesn't happen often, not even in early cold snaps. It's usually alive with sound. I was sitting on a log, eating a protein bar when I noticed it. There was a pile of rocks, small, about knee-high, at the edge of the clearing. I hadn't seen it yesterday. It was stacked too carefully to be natural. Balanced stones, no mortar, nothing random about it. I walked over and crouched down. There were scratches on the stones. Thin, deliberate lines, almost like tally marks. I counted them, 47. I took out my phone, snapped a picture. Not for evidence or anything. I just didn't want to forget the details later. I didn't touch the pile. I've seen enough weird stuff in the woods to know better. Some hikers do odd rituals, memorials, or art installations. Still, this was deep in, and the stone stack felt out of place. Too careful, too hidden. I logged the pile as unknown man-made marker and went about my day. That night, I made a small fire in the stove just to chase out the chill. It crackled nice and warm, but I still felt uneasy. Something about that stack stayed with me. I fell asleep early. This time I woke to something else. It wasn't a sound. It was light. There was a flickering glow coming through the window. Not the moon. It was too irregular. I sat up and looked. The light moved like firelight, but from outside. I grabbed my boots and stepped out. Off in the woods, just beyond the edge of the clearing, something was burning. Not a big fire, just a small flame, maybe the size of a lantern. But it was moving back and forth slowly. I thought maybe a poacher, someone trespassing. I called out once, loud enough to carry, but not to startle anything. No reply. The light kept moving, then dropped out of sight. I stayed out there for a while, sweeping my light through the trees, but I saw nothing. No footprints the next morning. No ash. No signs of campfire. Nothing. I decided to cut the stay short. I packed everything up, logged the closure, locked the cabin, and left just after breakfast. I took a different route back, an old service trail not maintained anymore, but faster if you can navigate the deadfall. I wanted to be out by the next night. A few miles in, I started noticing marks on trees. Small, vertical scrapes, all about shoulder height. Not claw marks. Too thin, too even. I counted 6 of them, spaced out irregularly. They weren't deep, just enough to scar the bark. I've seen boundary marks before, blazes, and such. This wasn't that. These were fresh. I kept moving faster. Then I saw the second pile. Another stack of stones. This one was shorter, about a foot tall. Still deliberate, still covered in those thin tally marks. Only this one had fewer, 15. I didn't stop long, just long enough to snap a photo and mark the GPS. About 4 miles out from camp, I noticed I was being followed. No sounds, no footsteps, just that feeling again, the pressure in the air, like something was too close. I checked my 6 more times than I want to admit. I never saw anything, but it was there. I moved fast and didn't stop. Got to my camp at Lost Elk just before dark. Made a fire bigger than usual. Ate quickly, hung my food, and sat with my back to a tree until well after midnight. I didn't sleep, just waited for first light. Hiked the last leg out in record time. Didn't eat, didn't stop. Back at Ridgeline Station, I checked in with the radio operator and signed off the log. Didn't tell him anything weird. Just said the cabin was locked and stocked. Standard procedure. Then I printed the pictures. That's when I noticed something that still makes me feel sick. The tallies weren't random. In the photo of the first pile, 47 marks, I could see it clearly now. They were in sets of 5, and carved below the pile, barely visible unless zoomed in, was a shape. It was a crude outline of a man. Stick figure, head, arms, legs. The second pile, 15 marks. Same figure. Smaller, fainter. I reported it, marked the GPS, and submitted the photos. My supervisor logged it as unconfirmed human activity and filed it away. No follow-up, no incident report. A week later, I found a third pile, not in the backcountry. This one was by my truck, parked at the trailhead. Just 5 stones. No marks, no figure, but I knew what it meant. I don't go near Split Pine Basin anymore. Not because I'm scared of stories or I worked as a seasonal backcountry ranger in a remote section of the Kaibab Plateau in northern Arizona, close to the north rim of the Grand Canyon. This was back in 2012, a season where we had an unusually dry spring and fewer visitors. My assignment was the North Base Trail area, which gets a tiny fraction of the foot traffic compared to the South Rim. You're lucky if you see 2 hikers in a week out there. That suited me just fine. I liked the silence, the distance from people, the way the wind spoke clearer than voices ever could. The district issued me a high-clearance Forest Service truck, a radio that barely worked, and enough supplies to stay out for up to 10 days before resupply. I set up my base camp near an old fire lookout that hadn't been manned in decades. It was a skeleton of a thing, rusted supports, peeling wood. and broken glass. But it gave me some elevation to check smoke columns or scout for illegal camps. I pitched my tent a little ways off. I didn't like sleeping under something that could fall over in a windstorm. Out there, you log everything. Footprints, smoke, human scat, unusual noises, whatever doesn't fit the background. And when you're alone, you notice everything. The way pine needles sound when they drop one at a time. The difference between a crow and a raven. The crunch of a rock under something heavier than a fox. You pay attention because it's the only thing that keeps you from walking off a cliff or running into a pissed-off bull elk. The first week went smooth. Dry days, cold nights. No hikers. No fires. A couple of bobcat prints, a dead jackrabbit, and the usual signs of deer around the spring. On the seventh night, around 2 a.m., I woke up because I felt something was off. It wasn't a noise. It was the absence of it. That part of the canyon always has a low hum. Bugs, distant yips of coyotes, whined through dry grass. That night, nothing. Like the landscape had gone deaf. I unzipped the tent and stepped out barefoot onto the dirt. The moon was full, clear as day. I didn't see anything, but I felt something. A sensation I'd only felt once before, years earlier, when a mountain lion had stalked me for nearly a mile without me knowing until I turned and saw its eyes flash in the dark. That same tightness in the chest. The gut whispering, something is watching. I did a slow pan with my flashlight. Nothing. No eye shine, no shapes. Just a broken lookout against the moonlight and the long drop into the canyon beyond. Next morning, I hiked out to check my cams. Motion-triggered wildlife cameras set along trails and watering holes. One of them had been turned. Not knocked over, just rotated slightly to face the wrong direction. I checked the SD card. No images past the morning before. Batteries full. Something had moved the camera without triggering it. I reset it, marked the date and time on my notebook, and moved on. I chalked it up to wind or maybe a curious raven, even though it didn't sit right with me. 2 days later, I picked up something odd. I was hiking back toward my camp around dusk when I noticed a parallel trail. Not one cut by deer or elk. This was boot tread. Human. Deep tread, maybe military style. Fresh. I followed it for about a mile. It never crossed the main trail, just ran along it like someone was mirroring the path but didn't want to be seen. It ended near a sandstone shelf overlooking a dry wash. From there, nothing. No sign of a camp, no wrappers, no prints continuing. Like the person had just vanished or climbed up the rocks and disappeared. I reported it to base that night via the sat phone. Static made most of the call unreadable, but I managed to get the basics through. Possible unauthorized hiker. Not sure if they're still in the area. Will monitor and update. Nobody seemed overly concerned. 3 more days passed. No new prints. Nothing on the cams. My water supply was getting low, so I planned to make the 12-mile trek down to the Ranger Cache to refill and check in. I left at first light. About halfway through the hike, in a narrow part of the trail where the canyon walls pressed in close, I smelled something wrong. Not rot. Not decay. It smelled metallic, sour, like rust mixed with sweat. I paused and scanned the ridges. Nothing. But I noticed something wedged under a manzanita bush. Tan fabric. I climbed up and found a torn section of a military-style backpack. Mall webbing, dirt caked, a few dark stains. Nearby, I found the bottom half of a plastic meal pouch. Something like an MRE, but the label was burned off. No tracks around it. Just the pack fragment and the wrapper, as if someone had buried them and then decided to dig them up again. I carried them with me the rest of the way. When I reached the Ranger Cache, I logged everything and stashed the pack and wrapper in a lockbox. I considered staying there overnight, but something pulled me back toward my base camp. I don't know what it was, routine maybe, stubbornness. But I repacked and made it back up the trail before nightfall. My camp looked undisturbed. My tent was zipped, fire ring cold, gear stashed properly. But inside my tent, everything had been moved. Not stolen, just moved. My sleeping bag was unrolled, but not how I'd left it. My notebook was open to a page I hadn't written on yet. My boots were side by side, toes pointing toward the flap. I always leave them lying on their sides to avoid scorpions crawling in. And my knife, the fixed blade one I kept tucked beside my sleeping pad, was lying out in the open. Clean, but not where I left it. I stood there for a long time, trying to breathe slow, trying to think. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, knife in hand, listening. Nothing came. The silence was back. Even the wind held its breath. Next morning, I packed up. No hesitation this time. I radioed in and said I was relocating temporarily to the Lower Ranger Station until I could get backup or confirmation that the area was clear. I hiked hard that day. Didn't stop for lunch. Every rock out of place made me flinch. Every bird call made me brace. When I reached the station, I locked the door behind me and finally let myself rest. A field supervisor arrived the next day with a new radio and orders to stay at the station until we sorted things out. I turned over the pack fragment and meal wrapper. They were sent off to the regional office. No follow-up ever came. Later that season, just before I rotated out, I got curious and hiked back up there with a buddy, another ranger older guy trusted. We found the camera again. This time it was gone. Not broken, just removed. Post still in the ground, straps gone, no sign of struggle. We searched the area for 2 hours. No prints, no trash, no sound. Same silence. I left the job after that season. I worked other districts, but I never went back to that part of the North Rim. Months later, off duty, I got an anonymous email sent to my personal account. No message body, just a subject line. You should have stayed gone. Attached was a single image. It showed my tent, my sleeping bag, me asleep inside. Photo taken from just outside the flap. Date stamp? The night I didn't sleep. I've been a backcountry ranger for a little over 9 years. My job takes me away from cell towers, away from towns, away from people. That's why I do it, to be honest. I like the quiet. The forests feel like a place where the world makes sense, until they don't. My district is in a forgotten corner of the Northern Rockies. It's mostly roadless. You have to hike in or go on horseback. We've got about 2 million acres of forest and maybe 3 permanent rangers to cover it. It's old forest, rugged country. We call a big chunk of it the Sink because it's shaped like a basin. It's where the mountains curve inward and everything funnels down into one low, muddy valley. It's dark even during the day because the trees there grow tall and close together. The sun barely reaches the ground. I try not to camp there when I can help it. This happened to me in early September 2 years ago. The incident started like most of them do, with a minor report. A couple of seasoned hikers checked in with our dispatch and never checked back out. That happens sometimes. People forget to call in. Batteries die. We don't panic unless they're overdue by more than 48 hours, or unless we hear something else, like weather moving in or signs of trouble. This was the first week of September. Hunting season was starting. People were on the move. A week earlier, we'd had 3 overdue calls, all of which turned out to be false alarms. But this one felt different. These hikers, Caleb and Jenna, both in their 30s, had started their loop through the Sink and were due to come out near Dead Man's Pass on the 3rd. The 3rd came and went. By the 5th, I was on assignment. I packed my standard load: tent, bag, stove, GPS, trail radio, medical kit, maps. I signed out a Glock from the lockbox at base and carried it in a chest holster. Not because I expected to need it, but because protocol said I should. I didn't bring bear spray. I don't like how it smells, and I know how to behave around bears. I hiked in from the East Ridge. The climb was steady, but nothing unusual. The air was crisp and dry. The only sound was wind through the firs. I didn't see anyone on the trail for the first 5 miles. That was normal. This isn't a popular area. Too rough. Too isolated. The trail into the Sink drops fast after a narrow saddle called Goat Notch. The whole thing feels like you're stepping down into a bowl. The trees get taller, thicker. You lose signal pretty quickly. My radio kept its short-range frequency, but I wouldn't be able to hit repeater towers again unless I climbed back out. I made camp near a place called Hemlock Creek. There's a clearing there where the rangers before me had built a rough campsite. Rock ring, down logs for sitting, a flat patch for tents. I boiled water and made instant noodles. The stars came out around 9. I heard a few owls calling. Otherwise, nothing. No signs of animals. No insects. It was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing echo under the tree cover. The kind of quiet that makes you sit up and listen harder just to make sure it's really that silent. I slept fitfully. The next day, I pushed west along the trail, following where the hikers should have gone. It rained that morning, just a light drizzle, enough to keep the ground slick and the rocks loose underfoot. I found a fresh boot print in the mud around noon. Vibram sole, looked like a size 10. Could have been Caleb's. The ground was wet, so it was hard to date. But it was something. A few yards past the print, I saw what looked like a torn corner of a Mylar wrapper, maybe from a protein bar. I bagged it and marked the GPS coordinates. I kept moving downhill. By late afternoon, I reached the bottom of the sink. There's a place there called Alderbach. The trees open up slightly, and it turns into this soupy, low forest with wet black soil and short, moss-covered shrubs. It's always colder down there, and it smells bad, like rotting roots and old water. That's where I found the first real sign. A backpack, half buried in the muck, snagged under a fallen log. Bright orange. I recognized the brand from the missing hikers' forms. I pulled it free. It was heavy, waterlogged. The main compartment was zipped, but filled with mud. There were claw marks on one side. Not bear marks. Something sharper, closer together. Not wide like a bear's paw. Almost looked like it had been dragged across rocks. I unzipped the main pocket. Inside, a soaked paper map, a collapsed water bladder, and a small zippered pouch of personal items. Some meds, a toothbrush, a lighter. No food. No diary. No phone. No GPS beacon. No blood. I marked the site on my map and tried radioing it in. No reply. Not unexpected. I kept hiking west, looking for higher ground to send out a signal. That night, I camped near a ridge the old rangers used to call Whistler's Break. I never found out why. I didn't hear any whistling that night, but I didn't sleep much either. I kept thinking about the backpack, the marks on it. I couldn't tell if it had been there for days or just hours. At around 3 a.m., I heard movement in the trees. Not far. A crack, a rustle, then silence. Something large. Maybe an elk. Maybe a black bear. But it didn't move like either. It moved quietly, then froze completely every time I shifted in my bag. I know what natural animal behavior sounds like. This wasn't that. I stayed still for a long time, hand resting on the Glock. It eventually left, or at least I stopped hearing it. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I broke camp at sunrise and pushed hard toward the last known waypoint on the hikers' planned route, a high meadow called Split Rock Flats. There's an old fire lookout up there. It's been boarded up for years, but the roof's still solid, and sometimes rangers use it for shelter. I reached it by mid-afternoon. The lookout had been broken into. The lock was busted clean off. Inside, I found trash scattered across the floor, wrappers, a crushed water bottle, sock. No sleeping bags. No fire in the old stove. One of the glass panes was cracked. Something heavy had slammed into it. There were dirty prints on the floor. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Toes splayed wide. Sunken into the dust like someone had stood there for a while. Too wide to be human. I sat down outside the shelter and tried the radio again. No reply. I pulled out my topo map and started looking for natural exit points. If Caleb and Jenna had gotten into trouble, if they'd been chased or injured, they'd head either downslope toward water or upslope toward visibility. I decided to follow the ridgeline southwest. That's when I smelled it. Rot. It drifted in on the wind. A sharp animal rot, blood, meat waste. You never forget that smell. I followed it off trail, working downslope. About 300 yards into the woods, I found the source. A deer, at least what was left of one, ripped open from neck to belly. Spine snapped. No head. No bite marks that I could see. It looked like it had been gutted and tossed. No scavengers had touched it yet. That meant it was fresh. Too fresh. I backed out and kept moving, now fully alert, safety off on the Glock. That evening, I reached a narrow gully marked on my map as Dry Fork. It was supposed to be bone dry this time of year. It wasn't. Water trickled through it, brown and slow. Along the bank, I saw more prints. Human this time. 2 sets. One smaller than the other. The smaller set had a limp, drag marks in the soft mud. That could have been Jenna. I followed them. The tracks curved north along the bank for about a quarter mile before disappearing at a rocky outcrop. I climbed it. On the other side, I saw a flash of color. Blue nylon. A tent. I moved fast but careful, staying low. The tent was collapsed, one side torn, the fly flapping in the wind. No one inside. The zipper had been half melted like it had been held over flame. I looked around. There were signs of a fire pit nearby. Burnt logs, ash, no food tins, no water bottles. Then I found the journal. It had been jammed into a tree fork like someone wanted it hidden. Water damaged, but still legible. I flipped through it. Most entries were basic: mileage, meals, trail notes. The last few pages were frantic, the handwriting rough and jagged. The last entry read, asterisk, we heard it again. Not a bear. We climbed to the lookout, but it followed. Something is wrong with the woods. Jenna hurt her ankle. I'm going to find help. If someone finds this, go back. Don't follow. Don't stay in the sink. Asterisk. That entry was dated September 2nd. 4 days earlier. I packed up the journal and started moving fast. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to rest. I hiked until night fell, then I hiked some more. The forest around me felt tighter than before, like the trees were leaning in. At one point, I turned around and swore I saw movement just behind a rise. But when I raised the flashlight, there was nothing. I made it back to Hemlock Creek just before midnight. I didn't set camp. I didn't eat. I sat against a tree, Glock in hand, eyes on the trail. By dawn, I was back at Goat Notch. From there, I finally got a radio signal. Dispatch picked up after 3 tries. I gave my location, told them I had signs of the missing hikers, requested a chopper. I didn't wait for an answer. I kept hiking. When the bird lifted me out that afternoon, I looked down at the canopy below. It looked calm, peaceful, like it always does from I've worked as a park ranger for 12 years. Most of that time, I was in the Pacific Northwest. Thick green forests, damp soil, rain that soaks into your bones. It's easy to lose track of time up there. You can walk for miles without seeing another human being, and sometimes that's what I liked most about it. But what happened to me during my second season at Clearwater State Park changed the way I look at the job and people for good. Clearwater isn't a big park. It's not one of the famous ones. Most people haven't heard of it unless they're from within a couple counties. We had maybe 4 short trails, 1 medium-length ridge trail that got you some nice views, and then a few unmaintained service roads that the public wasn't supposed to be on. Most of the time, the job was simple. Clear fallen branches, check the backcountry box toilets, haul out trash lazy hikers left behind, and keep an eye out for fire hazards. There were only 3 of us on staff that season, me, Dan, and our supervisor, Carla. Carla mostly stayed at the station unless there was something serious. Dan was older, near retirement, and had an old knee injury that flared up a lot. So most of the heavy field work fell to me. I didn't mind. I liked being alone. I liked the forest. It made sense to me in a way that people didn't. Early that August, Carla asked me to check a part of the park boundary that hadn't been looked at in a while. She said we'd had some motion from one of the old trail cams on the south end, near Dead Horse Ravine. No one called it that officially anymore, but we all knew the name. Years back, a hunter had found a half-rotted horse carcass down there. Probably slipped or was pushed. Since then, the name stuck. I packed light, just a day pack, extra water, a laminated map, a radio, and a few Cliff Bars. I carried a .357 on my hip, park issued. Mostly for bears, sometimes for people. I wasn't expecting either that day. I started out from a service road, just after sunrise. It was a perfect morning, cool, dry, birds chirping. The forest felt alive in that peaceful, early morning kind of way. I moved quick, cutting through the thinned area by the burn zone from a few years back, and then dipped down into thicker timber. After 2 hours, I made it to the spot where the old trail cam had been mounted. It was barely hanging on, strap frayed, the case cracked from sun and rain. I pulled the SD card, pocketed it to give to Carla later, and kept moving. I figured while I was down there, I'd check the ravine itself. There've been stories about it over the years. Kids getting hurt, folks going off trail and needing rescue. I'd never actually been down in it myself. It wasn't exactly forbidden, just remote. The terrain was rough, and there wasn't anything interesting down there except steep rock, stunted trees, and animal trails. I found an old game trail leading toward the edge. It was hard to follow, overgrown, and a few spots where fallen limbs blocked the way. I pushed through anyway. About 15 minutes later, I came to the rim. The ravine yawned open like a scar in the earth. Maybe 200 feet wide, maybe 70 or 80 feet deep. It sloped down in a series of ledges and thick underbrush. At the bottom, it looked like there was a dry creek bed. I remember standing there and getting that weird feeling you sometimes get when you're out alone, like you're being watched. But I didn't see or hear anything. No movement. No birds either. That struck me as odd, but I chalked it up to time of day. I started making my way down. It was slow going. Loose dirt, slick spots under the leaves. I had to lower myself down one steep rock using a tree root like a rope. Once I hit the bottom, it was even quieter than before. Not even wind. I moved up the dry creek, checking for tracks. At first, there were just the usual signs, deer, maybe a coyote. Then I found something strange. A sock. Just a single, white sock, lying half buried in the silt. Looked like it had been there a while. No way it blew down here by accident. The edges were stiff with mud. I took a picture of it, marked the location, and kept going. About 50 yards farther, I found a rusted folding chair leaned up against a boulder. The canvas seat was torn, frame eaten through with rust. Beside it, a dented can of beans with no label. An old boot, no foot in it, thank God. It wasn't recent. None of it was. But someone had camped down there at some point. The forest was already starting to reclaim it. Moss growing up the legs of the chair, twigs caught in the folds of the boot. I walked a little farther. That's when I found the tarp. It was brown, almost the color of the dirt, and spread out low between two trees. Tied off with old cord, fraying at the edges. I ducked underneath. There was a small camp under it. A backpack, empty food wrappers, some flattened cardboard, and what looked like a homemade fire pit lined with stones. The air under the tarp smelled sour, like sweat and mildew and something worse. I crouched down, took a few pictures, then poked around with a stick. In the backpack, I found clothes, men's medium-sized. A few t-shirts, socks, an old flannel. No ID, no wallet. A plastic water jug with algae growing inside. A spoon bent at the handle. I radioed in my location. Carla said she'd notify law enforcement and asked me to wait there for the sheriff's office. It'd be at least 4 hours. That's when I heard the snap of a twig from farther down the ravine. I stood up slowly, listened. Nothing. Then another one. Closer. It could have been an animal. It could have been the wind. But it didn't feel like either. I backed out from under the tarp and scanned the tree line. Still nothing. I moved behind a tree and waited. More silence. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe 15 minutes. Maybe longer. Eventually, the sheriff's deputy arrived. Young guy named Weller. He was quiet, methodical. Took my statement, bagged some of the things I found, and started taking photos of the tarp site himself. While he worked, I kept scanning the slope. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby, watching, listening, but we didn't see anyone. No fresh footprints, no cigarette butts, no gear stashed nearby. Nothing. Weller said he'd hike back out and call in a proper search team. He wanted to treat it like a possible squatter site, maybe even related to a missing persons report they'd had the previous year. But no way to know yet. I offered to stay and wait for the search team to show up. He agreed. So I waited. About an hour later, I heard another noise. It wasn't a twig this time. It was a low scraping sound, like something being dragged. Then a thump. I turned and saw movement near the far wall of the ravine. Someone was up there. I crouched low and pulled out my binoculars. There was a man on the ledge about 60 feet up. Shirtless, covered in dirt, hair long and matted. He was dragging something, a bag maybe, big and heavy. I couldn't make out his face, but I could tell he was strong. Thick arms, moved like someone used to lifting weight. He didn't look down. He didn't stop. He just dragged that bag along the edge and disappeared into the trees. I radioed it in immediately. Gave a description. Weller told me to stay put. Backup was on the way. I felt exposed down there in that dry gully with no cover. I moved up the side slope until I found a spot behind some rocks. I stayed low, waited. The search team arrived 2 hours later, 5 guys, some with dogs. We went up where I'd seen the man. We found a trail, but it was crude, more like a path worn by animals or to someone trying not to leave a clear trail. It twisted back into the hills, crossing a ridge, then dropping down into a narrow draw. That's where we found the lean-to. It was made of saplings and tarps, low to the ground. Inside were bones. Lots of them. Animal, mostly raccoon, deer, even some kind of bird. But there were others too. Small, human-sized. The dog started going nuts near the fire pit. One of the handlers called me over. They found a belt buckle in the ashes, with initials burned in JL. Back at HQ, Carlo pulled a record. A man named John Laird had gone missing the previous summer. Hiker, mid-30s. No known mental illness, no record. He'd gone off trail, they thought, and gotten lost. No one had found a trace of him. Until now. Forensics came the next day. Confirmed what we already feared. The bones in the fire pit were human. Two separate individuals. One of them was John Laird. The other, unknown. They never found the man I saw dragging the bag. The trail he used ran cold after 2 miles. No prints, no DNA, no gear. Just vanished into the backcountry. But I think about him all the time. The way he moved. The way he never looked back. Like he knew we were there and didn't care. A month later, I put in for transfer. I still work in parks. But I don't go down into ravines anymore. Not unless I absolutely have to. I carry more than just a .357 now. I check my 6 every 10 minutes. I double back on my own trail just to see if anyone's following. Because out there in the silence, there are people who've slipped through the cracks. People who live off the land. People who don't want to be found. And sometimes they're not just hiding. They're hunting.